This took place around maybe 15 years ago. I would have been about 13 years old. My dad has always taken an annual fishing trip with friends that would put him out of state for about a week. I have numerous stories about weird things happening while he was gone on said fishing trips, from paranormal events to someone even attempting to break into our house at one point. But this one is the most unnerving to people when I tell it. When my dad would go on these trips, I would usually sleep in my parents' bed. My mum and I would treat it like a little sleepover, and would watch movies, stay up late, even on school nights, and gossip. I remember falling asleep after a late-night movie, and being roused from my sleep with what felt like just minutes later. My mum is a light sleeper, while I, on the other hand, it takes pretty much a catastrophic level event to wake me up from a dead sleep. I remember waking up feeling as if something was wrong. The room was illuminated oddly, and there was a distant sort of rhythm that I was only partially aware of. I mean, I'm half asleep, and as I open my eyes, I can see my mum on top of the bed, on her knees peering out the window above her head. I started to ask, "What's going on?" when she turned to me quickly and shushed me. I quietly joined her, looking out the small box window that was slightly cracked open, and the distant rhythmic chanting became more and more clear. Our house sat in front of a strip of woods, and the trees aren't too thick. You can see through most of the wooded area, in fact. The chanting was getting louder, though, by the second, and the odd illuminations finally made sense. You could see a line of hooded figures in dark clothes, holding torches marching east, chanting what sounded like demonic or dark things. It felt surreal and scary as we held our breath waiting to see what they would do. Were they headed towards the houses to burn them down? Were they going to attempt to break in and sacrifice us? It felt like ages that we sat there, watching this line of people walk through the woods, their torches raised high and their chanting continuing throughout the night. But that was it. They just walked away. After what was probably more like 2 minutes, my mum and I laid back down and discussed what the heck we just saw, trying to get back to sleep. We told my dad first thing in the morning when he called to check in, but I remember him not believing us. He thought that it had to be a dream or something. That kind of thing just didn't happen in our small town in Ohio. But the next day, there was an article in the local newspaper about a lamb being slain on a makeshift altar on the east side of town. My dad stopped doubting us at that point, and my mum and I got even more freaked out. My parents still live in that house, and we've never seen any other cult-like behavior in the area, but that one evening, it definitely freaked us out enough that I decided to permanently camp out in my parents' bedroom every time that my dad left town, until my late high school years. In upstate New York, every house that I ever lived in was haunted, it seemed. The most haunted house was this 3-story house that we lived in. It has an attic, a second floor, a first floor, and a basement. You can turn this into a duplex rental, and upstate New York houses are very cheap compared to New York City houses. You can get a 4-bedroom house in upstate New York in 1999 for only about $70,000. And this story happened when I was a little kid. We lived in that big old dying house, and we didn't experience activity for like 6 months, close to a year in fact. But because the activity got really, really bad, and we didn't even bring anyone in to bless the house or try to communicate with these things, my former aunt sold the house for cheap and we moved somewhere else. What's funny though is that the new house that we moved into was also haunted. Anyways, the activity skyrocketed, it seemed, after living there 6 months to a year. It started with misplaced objects, missing objects, appearing in another room or random places in the house. It went from that to mimicking my family's voices and habits too. I also saw a little girl whose face appeared to be sort of blurred out. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, and she didn't show me her face. It was sort of white and blurry, like I said. I also saw a shadow dart back and forth. My mum saw a full-body ghost of a black man walking from the fireplace to the bathroom and then disappearing. She saw him at 5 a.m. when she was in the kitchen looking out into the living room. The ghost apparently showed her his full face, and she said that she saw everything as if he was alive, but he disappeared into the bathroom wall. I was just a little kid at the time, so I didn't really have any control over what my family was feeling or how they were reacting. If I still lived in New York, I would have looked up the history of the house for sure, but it's too late now. The ghosts went from showing themselves to mimicking, though, to mimicking what was the creepiest and scariest memory that I had. I was 10 years old, and I remember coming home from school at one point. I was alone upstairs. The dogs were always downstairs at that time, and this thing must have watched my routine and knew when I came home from school, because right when I was inside my room to change, I began to hear the dogs whining and barking in the upstairs living room. I walked to go and look for the dogs. I saw nothing. I went back to my room. I heard the dogs barking and whining again in the living room. I came back out to the living room to look for them, but again I saw nothing. This thing must have messed with me for a week until one week I got sick and tired of it. I came home from school and I closed my door. I began to hear the dogs barking and whining again, but this time I ignored it. It kept mimicking the dog and barking and whining, like it escalated louder and louder, and I just never came out of my room. I kept the door shut when, all of a sudden, everything just went completely quiet. It never tried to mess with me again after that, but it went on to mimic all of my family's voices. Everyone in my family all saw something and heard another family member's voices calling out to them at one point or another. We would always ask each other too, "Why did you call me?" And each time we would respond to one another saying, "I didn't call you at all." My brother heard me talking and calling out his name from my room, in fact, and I was at school at the time. He was home sick that day. He told me about it too, and he said that he heard me talking in my room and he went to go and check and there was nobody there. My mum also had a dream that one of the ghosts was telling her that they don't like us talking in an Asian language, which was really weird, but she confessed years later, after we moved out. For some reason, the ghosts only appeared to her. I only ever saw shadows and blurry faces and heard those mimicking voices, but she saw the whole face and even had some dreams too where they seemed to speak to her. This time though, it wasn't a black man. She said that she had a dream and saw a white guy come to her, and he told her in English that he doesn't like us talking in an Asian language. He doesn't understand what we're saying, apparently, and only me and my brother speak both languages. We always speak in English, so the ghosts apparently were able to understand us, or whatever. It was pretty crazy, though, and it got worse and worse until eventually we moved. We began to hear footsteps walking in the attic too and around the house at night. The TV would turn on and off by itself, doors would open and close by themselves. There's a door upstairs that would not close no matter what we tried to do as well. What I mean is that you would close it, and the next day it was always wide open again. This was back in the 90s, so my family never really thought to buy cameras to see why the door keeps opening by itself. But it got worse to the point where each family member was being haunted by something. My aunt kept seeing this ghost of this woman that had a routine. She would see the woman walk past her bedroom door. She followed the woman to the top of the stairs, and she saw the woman walk down the stairs and all of a sudden just disappear. She would see the ghost woman walk from downstairs to upstairs, and I have a feeling that this is the ghost that keeps opening the door in the back. I really don't know how it all works, but I'm assuming that she might have been killed while she was in that house or something, and she doesn't know that she's dead. I also had a dream about the same little girl that I saw before. At that time, I was only 10 years old, and I think that girl wanted to be friends, maybe. My brother had stolen one of my toys. I was crying and looking for it at one point, and I had a dream where a little girl in an old-fashioned dress with a blurred-out face came and talked to me, and she showed me where the toy was hidden. I woke up, and I went to the side of my grandma's bed, and sure enough, there was my toy hidden in the crack between the bed. I had a feeling that if we didn't leave that house eventually, then everyone in my family was going to die one by one, which I know is a weird feeling to have, but it was something that I was absolutely convinced of at the time. I think that whatever was in that house was angry because we split the house up and turned it into a duplex, maybe. We also rearranged everything in the house and threw away creepy old dresses and clothes that were found in the attic, so who knows. Maybe that too was something that made them angry as well. So, this is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me. This was in the 9th grade. There was this huge state park right outside of town that I lived in. And my friend and I would go down the trails every now and then. We'd been walking for maybe, 10 minutes when we realized that there was an older woman not far behind us. I only really noticed because of how out of place she looked, like she came right out of an old folks' home and was just dropped in the woods. But we were joking around about how creepy she was and sped up a bit, put some distance between us. But every time that we did, we'd look back and we would still be able to spot her. We must have done that probably 3 times, I think. We thought it was pretty funny, but we ended up running down the trail until we got to a small bridge. We hopped off the bridge into a creek and then went around a bend. We could still see the bridge from where we were, but we were cracking up about the whole thing when we saw the old lady again. Now, we had run for a good couple of minutes. There is absolutely no way she should have been able to catch us, especially that quickly. And it was like that she knew that we got off the trail because she was sort of just standing there on the bridge looking around. I think that that's when we both stopped thinking that it was funny. Again, there's just absolutely no way that she should have been able to get there like that. As soon as she left, we took off running the other way, and that was pretty much it. Nothing else happened, but I've always just thought the whole thing was just so creepy. I mean, there's this old lady sort of stalking us down a trail where we're isolated from anything, and then on top of that, we run and she somehow catches up to us when really she shouldn't have been able to. I still can't really explain the whole situation, but whatever happened that day, something was off. Around 10 years ago, while I was still living in a small village in the south of the UK, Loxheath to be exact, I used to travel to and from work by train. At the entrance to Swanwick Station is a long and sort of thin tree-lined road. Cars would often park all the way up this road. During one summer, every day while I was going down this road, there was this horrendous sort of gassy smell that I could always smell at this particular spot. I presumed that it was a dead animal along the hedgerow that had died and not been found. I remarked on this smell every day, which seemed to grow worse and worse as the summer progressed too, but could never identify where it was coming from. Well, in the end, it turns out that someone had murdered a woman and dumped her body in the boot of a car and abandoned it along the road. So for the entire summer, whenever I passed these vehicles, I was apparently smelling the decaying body of a homicide victim that had been missing for months. I will never forget that smell, even now. So I'd gone out to lunch with my dad one day, and my gas gauge was broken. I've never been good at math, and I accidentally miscalculated how much gas I had left. And instead of stopping near where my dad works, I decided to wait until I got back to my town where it's cheaper, which, as you can imagine, was a huge mistake. About 10 miles later on the highway, my car comes to a halt. I pull over and I call AAA to bring me gas, and while I'm waiting for AAA, a man in a truck pulls up behind me. He asked what happened. I explain that I'm out of gas. He offers to get me some so I don't have to wait for AAA. I say thank you, that would be really good. He then tells me that I need to come with him to get the gas. I ask why, and he says that I shouldn't be on the side of the road all alone like this. He says, come on, just get in. He won't bite. and he won't get the gas unless I can trust him. Well, another motorist must have saw me stranded and called the police to help me at some point, because I see a police car pulling up, and so does this man, and he literally peels out as fast as possible from the scene once he sees the police officer. Nothing happened to me, thankfully, but I can't help but look back on that event and just feel uneasy about it. I mean, I wonder what he would have done if I had gotten in his truck, or maybe if I had actually refused for a little bit longer. The whole situation, when I think about it, just gives me shivers. When I was roughly 13, a very close friend of mine invited me and my sister to come to her and her sister's birthday party at the campground. Megan and I were walking around the campground, just messing around with our sisters following somewhere behind us, doing their own thing. The adults knew what we were doing, and we live in a relatively small town, so they knew most people at the campground. So that wasn't weird for us to be allowed to walk around the loop like that, but we were passing a camper when we were nearing the pond that they had there, when Megan said that she knew the people who were staying there and that they had a girl who was close to our age and she had a brother. We stopped by and asked if the girl wanted to walk with us. She accepted and we were off again. I don't remember this girl's name, but she kept mentioning her brother and how he told her that he thought that I was so cute when we stopped by the camper. We walked to the pond, probably playing it a bit, but then started walking back towards the girl's camper. When we get there, she said to me, "Wait, my brother texted me and that he wants to talk to you." He comes out and tells me that I'm pretty, and we exchange numbers. And the next day we're texting when I ask him his age, and he was an adult. I tell him that I'm 13, and he says that it doesn't matter. I can be his girlfriend still. I remember feeling really weird after that, and I just ended up blocking him after a few days of him texting me and me hardly replying, hoping that he would just stop. Mind you, too, I definitely did not look like an adult at the time. It was obvious that I was young and that I was a teenager. A few years ago, I worked at a P.F. Chang's not too far from me. It wasn't a bad job too, as it was something to keep me busy and earn myself some money before starting my next semester of college. One night, it was just like any other night. Things were slowing down and I was headed home, and I took the route that I normally took, and honestly, nothing didn't seem really off that night or anything. Well, this wasn't until I noticed that I was the only car on the road. For clarification, my shifts typically ended around 10:30, and there aren't too many cars driving at the time, especially on the weekdays. But I would at least see a few pairs of headlights on my commute home. On that night, however, there weren't any. In fact, I distinctly remember that the night was eerily still and quiet, but I didn't really pay too much attention to it. Since I had my music playing through my car speakers, I was just sort of driving away, but little did I know that I was about to see something that I could only describe as something that clearly didn't belong. I turned onto the road that leads up to the stop sign, turning into my development. At that very moment, my eyes immediately focused on something that was right in front of me. This creature was maybe about 2 or 3 car lengths away from me, so I got a pretty good look at it. The creature was on the road walking towards me on all fours, head on. If I could give a description of this thing, I would say that it looked like a dog, but something just didn't seem right. Like, first off, it was much too big to be a dog. You might say it might have just been a big dog, but I know that it couldn't have been. The sheer size of this thing just didn't make that possible. And secondly, by the way the creature walked, it didn't look at all natural. It was sort of in a crouch-like position, as if it walked like it was curious as to what I was doing. And if it was a dog or any other natural woodland creature, it would have moved as I approached, right? Like at least run away or something. It almost felt like it was pretending to be a dog. But the most distinct feature of all was that its eyes glowed, either from its nocturnal nature or maybe, I don't know, maybe they were glowing without my headlights reflecting off of them. Whatever it was light in color, probably grey, but my headlights didn't directly shine onto it, and it was partially in the dark as well. Keep in mind, I kept on driving forward while I was looking at it, and at that moment I just wanted to get the heck away from whatever that thing was. But when I made the turn into my development, I didn't look back because I just couldn't make myself to do it. And this might sound silly, but I was worried that it might have followed me home if I did. Thankfully, it didn't seem to, but I can promise that night I didn't get much sleep. And to this day, it's always left an impression in my memory that I can just never shake. If what I saw was just a normal animal, then something was definitely wrong with it. But if it was what I thought it was, then there's no chance that it was an animal, and that creature is possibly still lurking out there somewhere. Every so often I get the feeling when I drive that way that it may just be out there watching me too, which I know is probably just in my head, but still, it's unnerving to say the least. I'm 22, and this happened to me when I was about 7. I've remembered this for years, and nothing before or since has happened to me since then. I don't even think it was sleep paralysis too. In fact, I don't know what it was. What I do know is that I was fully awake when it happened, and I was able to move my body completely, but you can give some insight into what you might think it was. Demons, sleep paralysis, ghosts, my own mind. I don't know. I would like to know what you think. So when I was 7, me, my mum and dad, who are divorced now, used to live in this little grey house from 2007 to 2008. It was actually a pretty cute looking house, but my parents used to fight in it all the time, which seemed like it only started whenever we moved into this house. Because, weirdly before, I only had happy memories of how my parents treated each other, and didn't remember nearly as much violence that happened between my parents. I admit that it could just be that I don't remember their fights that took place before we moved into that house. However, I have a pretty good memory of everything else that's really specific during my childhood before that. Like our trip to Disney World that we took in 2006. I specifically remember no fights between my parents happening the entire time that we were there. I can even remember the Kodak cameras my mum used to take pictures from back then. A white Disney-themed t-shirt that I remember wearing for the majority of our trip to this day. Seeing lots of lizards, me wanting to visit this one fake talking tree that had a face down there every day, etc. I have a pretty good memory that's vivid from like 5 and up, and so I don't think that I'm misunderstanding or misplacing the facts here. I even remember the specific apartments that we used to live in next to my mum's parents' place, my grandparents, before we moved into this house, and my experience that I'm about to talk about took place in. My mum has always said that my dad always was violent and had anger issues, even before I was born when she met him, which I believe since to this day he still sort of has outbursts of anger. However, nothing that I remember as bad as the fights that happened between him and my mum whenever we moved into this house back in 2007. There would be screaming matches daily between my parents, which I remember yelling at both of them to stop. My dad would also constantly go out drinking around this time period and come home constantly making scary threats towards my mum. He would even sleep with weapons which he threatened to use on my mum. But around this time, I remember constantly feeling afraid and watched after my parents would tuck me into bed most of the time. What didn't help, though, was that they would always leave my door open, so I always felt like I was being watched by the pitch darkness between the hallway, my door, and at the other end of the hallway where our spare bedroom, where our family computer was. You could say that it's pretty common for kids to be scared of the dark, I know, but I haven't gotten to my main experience yet. What I'm getting at is that it wasn't uncommon for me to wet the bed at this time, and go and wake my parents up to sleep with them as a result of my fear. On the night that my experience happened, this was one of those many times. Only, I remember that my mum wasn't in bed, so I went to sleep with my dad. I can't remember exactly the reason why she wasn't there that night. In fact, I may not have known at the time. They might have already been separated around this time in the year, or my mum might have been out or something. But while me and my dad were in the middle of trying to lay down and go to sleep, I just remember that I couldn't fall asleep that night. I was laying down and so was my dad, but I couldn't just sleep, and at some point, I remember Dad's little TV that he had on in his room flashing blue and making a sort of static noise. However, I remember I told my dad this and he didn't believe me and just told me to go to sleep. Eventually, after a few minutes, I started noticing what looked like these, what I can only describe as creatures to the right side of me, both waddling on the bed towards me and some to the right of me on the floor. I remember only one of them being on the bed, and it kept sort of, I don't know, like, it seemed like it was endlessly waddling towards me, looking at me and turning its head to the left on repeat. Two of the same creatures were on the floor, standing to the right of the bed. They all resembled penguins to me, but they were all pure grey and black. They seemed almost to be made of, like, pure static. You could make a sort of beak out of the body shape, as well as wings. However, I can't remember what their feet looked like exactly. At the same time that I saw them, I was also seeing and feeling other things in this room that shouldn't have been there. Like, I eventually started feeling the sort of sensation of, I don't know, like worms crawling on my body, and I remember that I could also see them as well, something like worms all over me. To my left on the wall, there looked to be what's hard to describe, but sort of like a giant strip of a lettuce-lined like creature that was moving with small little skinny, stringly little tentacles on the side, and like a purple mask in the center of it. This whole time I was telling my dad that I was seeing something, and I was making nervous whimpering noises like a scared kid does, but I remember he just kept saying that he didn't see anything that was going on. I think that he thought that I was fighting sleep or something, but I was genuinely seeing things, and at one point, I tried waving my arm towards this waddling creature's body, but it just went straight through it. This all lasted for about an hour as well, from what I can remember, before they all slowly just started to sort of disappear. To this day, nothing similar has ever happened to me since or before that incident. So I'm convinced that I at least experienced something very strange, and I later found out that whenever we moved into that house from my mum years later, that every single couple who had lived there had apparently broken up. But I don't know if that's true or not. I'm really not sure how she would even know that, to be honest, but I also heard that the house was built on Indian burial grounds. Again, I don't know about all of that, but it's just rumors and hearsay. What I do know, though, is that the house has a bit of a strange reputation with people. That much is clear. But what do you guys think that I may have experienced back then when I was a kid? I'm dying to know if somebody else has experienced something like this, and if anybody has answers as to what this could be, then I would really love to know, because it's just such a strange and weird and creepy experience. It also feels like it wasn't long after this that's when I got stuck with chronic depression. It's still present, and it's something that I still battle with, but that's neither here or there for this story. Again, if you know anything about any of this, or have any theories or ideas or suggestions about what all this could be, then please do let me know. So this happened in a friend of mine's house, Dustin. This time we were hanging out in his garage, and it was myself, Dustin, and two of our other closest friends, Brandon and Drew. The four of us were all gathered in Dustin's garage, simply hanging out and talking about all manner of high school problems. When during the talk, Dustin had made his way to the opposite side of the garage, next to the door there, and the three of us hadn't noticed that this was strategic on Dustin's part. You see, there was another light switch in the garage, right next to the garage door. Dustin had hatched a scheme, apparently, to scare us by suddenly turning the lights out in the middle of our conversation. It was near midnight, and we were already pretty wound up. It was guaranteed to leave us in complete darkness as well. However, this didn't go his way or our way either. None of us knew what was about to happen that night. So Dustin turned out the lights, like I said, It startled us at first, but we quickly realized that it was just Dustin trying to scare us. We asked multiple times for him to turn the lights back on. He responded with poorly acted confusion. He eventually turned them back on for us, and the lights in the garage were very bright. We were blinded for a second or two as our eyes sort of adjusted back to the light, but that was when we saw it. For some strange reason, when the lights came back on, the three of us on the opposite side from Dustin were all facing the same way. We all faced the wall opposite the garage door, and it was painted white, so it made this very noticeable to us, because we saw a black handprint that was slightly faded. Just this lone handprint, right there in the middle of the wall. Now, that may seem like it's pretty easily explainable, and I'll admit if that's all it was, then it would be. However, what happened next, there's just no way that it can be explained. So the three of us mumbled to each other for a second, all asking if he remembered seeing that handprint before the lights went out. We all agreed that we hadn't, and that it was a bit weird. Dustin asked what was going on, and we told him that we saw a black handprint. He must have thought that we were joking, because he didn't take us seriously at all. In fact, he turned the lights out on us again, and this time we reacted with a little bit more anger, telling him to turn the lights back on. He tried to joke around with us, but we weren't in a joking mood at this point. He caught the hint eventually and turned the lights back on. When our eyes adjusted to the light again, we saw them. Multiple black handprints this time, all overlapping each other in a horizontal straight line, and they were definitely not there before. They were leading from one wall to the next, and every wall in the garage now had a line of overlapped black handprints. They were completely surrounding us, and it sort of looked as though something or someone had been running on all fours horizontally around us, circling us. Dustin, he definitely saw them this time as well, and the feeling of terror and panic set in for all of us. We practically trampled over one another trying to escape the garage. Drew pushed his hands and his head into my back, ramming me through the door into the house. The three of us spilled onto Dustin's living room floor, but we couldn't catch our breath quickly enough and kept shouting nonsense to each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We all had a hard time calming down, and we tried to convince ourselves that it didn't even happen in the end and that we only thought that we had seen the handprints. However, when we mustered the courage to go and check again, we were greeted with the handprints still being there. The garage then became a restricted area for us when we all hung out. The only time that we would go back in was to try and do our own investigating. We never cleaned the handprints off, mind you. They stayed there for ages. I'm not sure if it was out of fear of angering whatever had left them, or if it was just a reminder that it actually did happen. Either way, it is still one of the craziest experiences that I've ever had, and it is going to stick with me for as long as I live. So my son, an 8-year-old male, and I, 42 and female, were in his bedroom reading a story before bedtime. I had my back to the door and was just reading a children's bedtime story to my almost asleep son, when I heard from behind me my dad's voice calling my name. It startled me as we were home alone. I turned around quickly to see my dad, just rounding the corner heading down the stairs. I only saw the back of him, and only for a split second, but I knew that it was him. I called out to him, but he didn't answer. I got up and quickly followed him, and as I rounded the corner to the stairs, I saw him in a side profile, just turning the corner at the bottom of the stairs into the kitchen. I called out to him again, but still no answer, and I was just so confused. I headed down the stairs quickly to catch up to him, but as I rounded the corner into the kitchen, in an almost run at this point too, when I got there, he wasn't there. I quickly ran through the kitchen into the living room, expecting him to be there, but the house was empty and totally quiet. Now I was more than confused. I checked the entire house, in fact, checked the front and back doors, which were both still locked up tight. I called my dad on the phone, and he answered straight away and said that he was at home, 4 miles away, and hadn't left all evening. I was fully awake. I hadn't been drinking, and I've never taken any mind-altering drugs or anything like that. I have carbon monoxide alarms in the house, which I test weekly, so it's definitely not that. And to be honest, I still have no explanation for this, and I'm struggling to come up with one, because, to be honest, I would really like one. Last Sunday, I was walking home from work one evening when I noticed a man following me. He was wearing a coat, and his face was obscured by the shadows of the streetlights. At first, I tried to ignore him, thinking that he was just a stranger heading in the same direction as me. But as I turned down a dark alleyway to take a shortcut, I could hear his footsteps getting closer. My heart began to pound as I quickened my pace, but the man behind me seemed to be keeping up effortlessly. And suddenly, I felt his hand on my shoulder, and I spun around to face him. His face was still shrouded in darkness, but I could now feel his breath on my face as he leaned in to whisper something to me. "You shouldn't be out here alone, you know," he said in a raspy voice. "It's not safe." I tried to back away, but his grip on my shoulder tightened, and I could see the glint now of a knife in his other hand. I was trapped, alone in a dark alleyway with a stranger who was clearly dangerous and about to do something. As I stared into his shadowy face, I realized that there was no reasoning with this person. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I pulled out my pepper spray and I sprayed him in the face, and then I ran as fast as I could out of the alleyway and back onto the main street. When I looked back, I saw the man staggering around, screaming in pain and rubbing at his eyes. I didn't stop to see what happened next, but I knew that that night I had narrowly escaped a terrifying encounter. From that day on, I always make sure to always be aware of my surroundings and to never let my guard down when walking alone at night. And these days, I skip the alleyways. About 15 years ago, I travelled to Spain with my best friend. We were both around 20 at the time, living the carefree young adult life that we did. You know, just two guys having a great time, pretty much. We were in a warm country, no carefully filled itinerary whatsoever, just sort of living in the moment, doing whatever we felt like. My friend, who originally came from Spain, still had family there, which made the month-long travel very affordable since they offered us free accommodation, a roof over our head, a working bathroom with fresh showers, and 3 meals a day if we liked. They also gave us a spare key so we could come and go just as we liked. During the day, we often went swimming to keep us cool as possible, and during the evenings we often explored the city, went for drinks or went to a club or something. On a certain day, somewhat more to the end of our month-long stay there, the father of our host family, my friend's uncle, took us out for a fishing trip. We had a lot of fun out on the sea too, although the trip was cut short because we had a bit too much fun consuming beers, but the burning summer sun, too many beers, and the heavy wavy feeling of being out at the open sea made for a very bad case of seasickness for both my friend and me. His uncle, though, it was funny to him. After having an afternoon rest, or as they called it, a siesta, and a very fulfilling late-night dinner, we decided to go back out to the beach. We took a couple of cold beers with us. However, we didn't take many as we were still feeling a bit groggy from before. It was a beautiful night, open sky, no clouds, little to no light pollution, making the twinkling stars very visible and present. Being on vacation, being young, on a still warm but comfortable summer night with a light breeze and a starry sky, it was the perfect moment to talk about the meaning of life, about what we would like to achieve one day, about what was worth it or what wasn't, if there was any other intelligent life out there, if we would live for another 1,000 years or not. The crashing of the waves against the sand of the beach and the rocks were very calming and was sort of lulling us into a meditative state. Only that moment in that place seemed to exist, and there was no outside world, no life with responsibilities, no obligations, no expectations, no working hard to get somewhere. And it was at that moment that we noticed something was off. The crashing of the sea against the sand of the beach sounded different. harder, like something was moving in it, and under the waves, a vague shape started to form. As it neared the shoreline, it started to take the shape of a dog of all things. We both looked at each other and noticed that we'd been holding our breaths for about a minute, that it took this dog to crawl from the sea to the shoreline. The tension broke because we both burst out laughing because we had been so easily startled by something so innocent. But then my friend asked the question that made the newly regained light mood go away in an instant. Where did that dog come from, though? There's no one around, and we never saw any dog go into the sea. Neither was there any dogs swimming around. It came from under the water. Now that he had worded it like that, it seemed rather curious, and actually, that dog seemed pretty big for any existing dog that I had ever seen. As it was crawling along the beach, solely illuminated by the first quarter moon, it looked like the size of a small horse, but in the shape of a dog or a wolf with sort of matted fur. It had very present bony joints in its knees and elbows, and walked a bit awkwardly too. My friend and I were debating if we should follow this beast, and we decided in the end that we did actually want to find out what exactly it was. I took out my phone and started to film it, for as far as any 2008 smartphone could film in the dark. By the time that we reached the place at the beach, where it had left the water, it had already reached the sand dunes, and sort of disappeared in it. We saw that it had left a track, and we decided to follow it into the dunes, but we weren't prepared for what we saw next. The beast had left a track in the wet sand in the form of individual hoof prints in a straight line instead of a crisscross pattern as with many four-legged animals. No horse could have walked in such a line, mind you, and even though it had looked like the size of a horse, it didn't look anything like the shape of one. Neither are horses aquatic animals, as far as I know. In any case, we followed the track to the dunes and went over the first dune when we saw the beast standing about 10 meters from us in a speck of moonlight. But it didn't look anything like a dog either. It looked like it had the lower half of a goat and the upper half of something like a werewolf or something. Just the dimensions were off and the shapes were really awkward, and it was such a big animal that neither of us could place under any existing animal that we knew of, with matted fur and bony joints that had just come out of nowhere from under the water of all things, but clearly could walk and survive on the land as well, that left hoof marks in a straight line. Because we had just stumbled through the bushes closely behind this beast, and had given away our presence, it slowly started to turn its head towards us. While it was turning towards us, it finally stood on its hind legs. Not only was this an animal that came from under the water, as well as could survive on the land and walk on four legs, it could clearly stand and walk very well on two legs as well. The beast gained even more size by standing on its hind legs, and must have been at least 2.5 meters tall. It stared at us with what looked like sort of red glowing eyes. These are not to be mistaken with the eyes of a nocturnal animal too, with reflective sort of aspects to them. These were actually glowing from within by what it looked like. Instantly, I felt stuck on my spot, completely frozen. But luckily, my friend, who was 2 steps behind me, had the mind to run away and pull me with him. We ran for what felt like an hour, but must have been maybe 10 minutes, because we reached the house of my friend's family before we knew it, completely out of breath. The beast, whatever it was, hadn't followed us, or at least not all the way. We went in and told the entire story to his uncle, and of course he thought that we must have still been drunk and tired and had seen things that weren't there. To be honest, I don't blame him too, but when we showed him the recording, he went pale. He took a shovel. A gun would have been more impressive against a beast like that, but it's not like the average European just has guns lying around, and asked us to show where we had seen it. We searched for almost 2 hours, but we didn't find this thing again. However, we did find the hoof marks, albeit a bit washed up because of the current of the sea and all that. But we went back home trying to make something of what we had just seen, but we just couldn't. We needed to know what animal we had just seen, so we started Googling all kinds of things. Of course, with the lower half of the beast looking like a goat, we stumbled upon a lot of myths about the devil, which we discarded. I mean, we had actually seen a live beast that wasn't known by humanity yet, and wanted to know if any other people had ever seen anything like it. It was only when we Googled hoof marks, one straight line, that we stumbled upon the term devil's footprints. So apparently this was an actual thing, or at least something that had supposedly been seen before, according to myths and stories. But they must have had some truth to them, since they described exactly what we had just seen with our own eyes. The few days that we had left in Spain, we spent our nights out with my friend's uncle trying to find this thing again, but to no purpose, as we never actually did find it. When I came home, a few days later, I saved the recording on my hard drive, and I'm really not sure what to do with it yet. I didn't want to be the crazy guy that had seen the devil, right? Because I still don't believe I did or anything. I just want to know what animal this was, and how come we haven't documented this beast yet. 15 years later, though, I'm still scratching my head over what the beast was that we encountered could have been. But by now, it's a story that my friends believe to be for making conversation, and that's about it. My friend and his uncle are still very affected by this experience as well. My friend even took it so far as to go live in Spain again, near the beach where it all happened, and still continues to actively look for whatever this thing was to this day. And who knows, maybe one day he'll find it. This happened when I was about 10. I'm female, dark brown hair and tan creamy skin. Average height, just so you get the full picture. But considering my age and build, I would not have fought back particularly well had something happened at that time. So at the time, I lived with my mum and younger brother, who must have been about 7 or 8. We all lived in a pretty secure area of town, and what's more, as our apartment had a security guard, to get into the lobby he had to buzz you in unless you had your own keycard. The elevator was activated by a keycard too, so either you had your own or a security guard would have to key you in. Also, a small screen inside of our apartment with a button to call security if needed was there too. This always made us feel safe to some extent, but my mum is a cautious person and is always very aware. We were moving and we sold a lot of stuff, including our TV, a normal size flat screen thing. But we couldn't take everything with us, so this had to go at the time. Eventually, a man, mid-30s or 40s, got in touch expressing interest in our TV. He said that he'd drop by our apartment the same day, and he did, but a little later than expected, at around 7 p.m. He does all the usual checks to see if it works properly, and eventually starts asking my mum about where my dad is. He lived abroad at the time. Then asks me questions like, where is my school and how old I am. Being a naturally friendly person, I answer and end up telling him all about a field trip that I took with my class to a beach and stuff like this. He then asks if he can connect his phone to our TV to project images of the beach. He apparently had been there before, and my mum reluctantly agrees, and he does so. In those pictures, there's a pretty young woman. He says that he's a photographer and would like me to model for him sometime. This is the point that my mum pulls me closer to her, frowning and politely declines. I don't suspect anything, and I'm in fact sort of excited and keep asking my mother to please let me model. She tells me to be quiet though and doesn't sound happy at all. He continues to talk about his photography and said that I would make a good model. On and on, like this for a while too, while I kept getting more eager and nagging my mum to let me do it. I had no idea of his intentions and was completely okay with the idea. I also noticed the woman on the photo was wearing a pretty skimpy bikini thing, and since I really wanted to be grown up, you all remember what it was like to be like that, I asked if I could wear one too. He said yes. My mum, I could tell, was completely freaked out by this point. I suspected nothing, of course, and with childlike innocence, I asked him if I would get money. Again, he said yes, and kept encouraging me to pose for him. Looking back now, I feel terrible for my mum, who knew exactly what was going on but couldn't stop me. On top of all of that, he told me repetitively how good a model I was while I giggled through pose after pose, tossing my hair, arms up above my head or hand on my hip. It was creepy. He's been there for over an hour now, mind you. He says that he's calling his friend to ask if he can buy the TV. But why would he do that? Who knows? He speaks with him for a bit though, then says that he needs to call his wife this time. Again, we let him. When he hangs up, my mum asks if he wants the TV again. He tries to start a random conversation to distract her, but it's really late and we're getting tired. My mum calmly explains that it's late now and her kids, my brother and I, are tired and need to shower and sleep. At which point the guy says, "Oh, that's fine, they can do that, I don't mind." Then encourages us to go and wash. Even I was creeped out by this point. My mum again told him to come back another day, and he got angry, insisting that he stay because he wanted to check this or that feature on the TV. My mum, though, stood her ground, but I could see now that she was scared, alone with this creep and 2 young children to boot. After a long argument, she turned to me telling me to go to my room with my brother. Needless to say, I didn't argue. We went into my room and shut the door behind us. I heard the front door open and my mum telling him to leave or she would call security. He again tried to stay, but she wasn't having any of it and said something along the lines of, "Yeah, no, get out of my apartment now or I'm calling the security." He finally left. My mum put us to bed. She probably didn't sleep at all that night, and we thought that that would be the end of it. The next day, though, he came back under the same pretext as before, but by now it was clear that he had absolutely no interest in the TV, just in us. Security, knowing what had happened prior to that day, immediately called my mum to know if it was okay to let him through or not. I asked if it was the photographer guy again. My mum nodded before motioning for me to be quiet, then told security that they weren't to let him in, thanked them for calling her first, and that was the end of it. Apparently, though, he got aggressive with security even, and they tried to show him out. I don't know if he tried anything after that, but I'll ask my mum and share any updates if I learn anything else. But there is just something innately wrong about a man who comes into a young mother's apartment, tries to recruit her kid for bikini pics or worse, then just refuses to leave after calling people. It's sinister and creepy, and I don't like to think what could have happened if he had stayed there much longer. So for context, I'm a complete skeptic when it comes to paranormal things, but what's been happening or going on in my home has the hairs on the back of my neck standing up straight. You see, a few nights ago, my fiancée, 21 and female, decided to go outside for a smoke. I, also 21 and female, stayed in the living room to watch Modern Family. A few minutes after she left, she texted me and asked if I had popped up in the dining room window to scare her. The dining room window overlooks her smoke area, so it would have been in perfect view of from where she was sat. She saw me, my glasses, the way that I had my hair tied back, smiling at her. She describes it as I was more so laughing at, as if she had caught me and then I ducked down and never reappeared. Keep in mind, I was sat in the living room, having no knowledge of this exchange. She came back in and we talked about it, and I literally thought that she was pranking me, bearing in mind that she was close to tears because she thought that I was pranking her. A few days passed and nothing else happened, until the other night. My fiancée went upstairs to go get changed into her pajama bottoms. I heard her steps as she went upstairs and again was left in the living room by myself. I then heard her stepping down the stairs and watched her open the door, only to hear her come down the stairs and walk through the already open door once again. This obviously spooked me, but I'm a skeptic, so I just sort of pushed it aside after explaining to my fiancée what I saw. But pan to last night, it was 3:47 in the morning, and my fiancée was using the bathroom. The bathroom is upstairs adjacent to our bedroom. I heard the bathroom door open and then proceeded to hear her footsteps descend down the stairs, only to quickly come back up like she was maybe checking to see if a light was left on downstairs or something. She texted me asking if her dad had come out of the bedroom, opposite of ours. Her dad has incredibly loud footsteps and are easy to identify. Obviously, I thought that they were her footsteps, and she was quite a skinny girl, so we both heard two different things. We have no idea what's happening in this place, but it's making us feel incredibly uneasy about being here in general. We would go someplace else, but my fiancée is ill and I'm working on getting my visa, so her parents have kindly taken us in. But what should we do? Are we experiencing doppelganger activity or something like it? And if so, how do we get rid of it? I honestly never thought that I would end up working at a funeral home. However, I found that job opportunities were limited, and when I came across the listing in the local paper, the money was too good to pass up. They even had an attached residence that I could live in rent-free to ensure that I was always on hand since I was their only security guard. Sometimes the job can be somewhat unnerving. Being surrounded by death on a daily basis takes its toll on a person for sure, but I remind myself that I'm here to keep the place secure and to make sure that everything runs smoothly. Every night before turning up, I would take a walk through the building to ensure that all the doors are locked and the lights are off as well. I checked on the mourners attending evening services if one is scheduled, making sure that they aren't causing any trouble or breaking any rules. I get up periodically through the night to make my rounds and ensure all is well. And if I hear anything out of the ordinary, I investigate it. At first, I thought that the job here would be, honestly, a piece of cake. All I had to do was patrol the building at night, keep an eye on the cameras, and ensure that nobody tries to break in. Beyond the morbid appeal, this place provides for young thrill-seekers, I guess. There are also chemicals stored here that an enterprising criminal could use in the manufacturing of narcotics, for sure, so intruders were a concern worth noting. However, as I settled into my new role, I began to realize that the job was more than I definitely anticipated. The funeral home itself was pretty creepy, with dimly lit hallways and creaky old doors. Every time that I walked down one of these dark corridors, I could not help but feel like someone or something was watching me. Sometimes I hear strange noises coming from the other side of the walls too. I see a shadow flash past in the corner of my vision, and sometimes I swear that I can feel a cold breath on the back of my neck too. Despite my unease, I tried to remain professional. After all, I am here to keep the place secure, not to be spooked by every little sound. However, as the nights wear on, I find it harder and harder to shake the feeling that something just isn't quite right. It wasn't until a few weeks into the job that things began to get strange too. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard a noise coming from one of my rooms that we use to store the prepped bodies in their caskets for upcoming funerals. It sounded like something was shuffling around in there. I tried to tell myself that there was a reasonable explanation, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I approached the door to the room, my heart started to race. I wondered if I was just acting paranoid, but the noise was unmistakable. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, trying to gather my courage. And finally, I turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, just a crack at first, trying to peek inside without making too much noise. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a casket in the center of the room. I tried to remember if there was a funeral scheduled for the morning, but I couldn't recall seeing the schedule that day. I listened for a moment, but the shuffling noise had stopped. I pushed the door open a little further, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I quickly spun around, my hand reaching for the flashlight on my belt, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the sweat starting to form on my forehead. I took a deep breath, stepped into the room, shining my flashlight around. The casket was still in the center of the room, and there didn't seem to be anything else out of place. But again, I just couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I finished my patrol of the room quickly and made my way back to my apartment, trying to calm my nerves. It was going to be a long night after that. The next night, I heard the noise again, though. My heart sank as I realized that the sound was not just in my head too, but was coming from the same room as before. Once again, I decided to investigate this issue. I slowly made my way down the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end again. As I approached the door, my palms began to sweat and my breath became shallow. My personal experiences have taught me to remain calm under pressure. However, this was a different kind of fear altogether. I pushed the door open slowly and peered inside, my eyes scanning the room once again for any sign of movement. To my surprise, there was nothing there. No people, no animals, no signs of any disturbance. The room was empty, and the only thing that greeted me was a really eerie silence, in fact. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Had I been up too late? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I also couldn't find any logical explanation for the noise. As I made my way back to my room, my mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Was there something in the funeral home that I didn't know about? I didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but I knew that I had to keep my guard up and stay alert. As the nights go on, the strange noises persist and I begin to feel like I'm being watched. It's as if someone or something is following me through the halls. Every time that I turn around, I expect to see a figure looming in the shadows, but there's never anything there. I start to become increasingly paranoid. I double-check the locks on the doors and the windows every hour, just to make sure that they're secure. I even start carrying a sidearm with me on my rounds, just in case. And things just continue to become even more stranger. One night, as I was sitting in my apartment, I heard a series of strange noises coming from outside. At first, I thought that it was just the wind, but the sounds grew louder and more persistent until they sounded like somebody was knocking at the door. I tried to ignore it, thinking that it was probably just some kids playing a prank, but the knocking continued, growing more insistent by the minute. It was as if someone was desperately trying to get my attention. Feeling a sense of unease, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. And to my surprise, there was nobody there. The hallway was completely empty, and there was no sign of anyone lurking in the shadows. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though. As I returned to my apartment, I felt a chill blow past me in my apartment. Once inside, I couldn't help but notice that the atmosphere had changed too. The air felt thick and heavy, and there was an unexplainable chill that seemed to permeate through every corner of that room. Uncomfortable, I retreated to my bedroom, hoping to get my mind off of the night's events. However, the knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, each time causing my heart to race with fear. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the persistent tapping at the door made it clear that it wasn't. And that was the moment when I realized that I just couldn't take it anymore. I need to find out what's causing these noises, and I need to put an end to it once and for all. The next day, I decided to talk to the funeral home director about my concerns. I half expected him to just sort of laugh it off, I guess, and tell me that I'm crazy, but to my surprise, he actually takes me seriously. He tells me that the funeral home has been rumored to be haunted for years, and that some of the staff have reported strange occurrences in the past, too. As time goes on, my interactions with the spirits are becoming more frequent and intense. I often hear whispers in my ear or even feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. Some nights, the spirits, or whatever they are, become angry and throw objects around the room now. I've taken to talking to them, in fact, as I make my rounds, as crazy as that sounds, as it makes me feel more comfortable, and I believe it actually helps to calm the situation down a bit. I've begun to realize, too, that not everything here seems to behave the same. Like, what I mean is that some things appear to be friendly and curious, whereas others sort of appear vengeful and aggressive. It's as if they each have their own stories to tell, and I'm the only one here to hear them. Despite my growing attachment to whatever this is, I've still had moments of fear and doubt for sure. There are nights when I hear something so terrifying that I just freeze in place, too afraid to move. But then a warm feeling comes over me, reminding me that I wasn't alone and that everything's going to be okay. I've started to document my experiences in a journal too, detailing the encounters that I had with the spirits and the strange occurrences that happen each night. I've even begun to research the history of the funeral home, hoping to uncover clues about the identities here and the motives. I haven't had much luck yet, but I'm optimistic. And although my job is unusual, I know that. I find a sense of purpose in my interactions with the dead. I know what I'm doing is something important, something that no one else could do as well. And who knows, maybe one day I'll even be able to solve the mystery of this place and help whoever might be here find peace. This encounter happened about a week ago, last Tuesday afternoon to be exact. I, a 30-year-old female, was catching up on chores and last-minute shopping on my day off. I was actually on my way home and had stopped at a gas station to fill up, so I wouldn't have to worry about it the next day before work. But the gas station that I had stopped at is usually pretty dead. It's a decent size, with like 24 pumps, I think. Because of the direction that I was headed, I parked at the very last pump, the furthest from the building on the inside. At the time, there was maybe half a dozen other people at the complete opposite end, with about 4 pillars or 8 empty pumps between us. I honestly wasn't paying too much attention to anyone, until this old beat-up looking white panel van pulled up to the outside pump on the other side of mine. Now, I'll admit that I'm a huge true crime nerd, as in started reading true crime novels at like the age of 11, and got a lot of notes home to my parents for it in fact, but that's a story for another time. So that sight instantly put me on edge. I tried my best to remain casual, but kept my attention on the van, and tried to move in a way the pump wasn't blocking my escape route if needed. Now, I was positioned toward the side of the pump, closest to the building, keeping the pump between me and the stranger, when this middle-aged looking man walked toward the other end of the pump, and close to me to try to get my attention. I didn't get any closer, but did lean forward to listen to him. He kind of quietly asked if I could help him with some gas. I mentioned quietly because I had to lean forward more and ask him what, so that he would repeat himself. He didn't get any closer and almost stuttered asking if I could help him with gas, staying on the far end of the pump from me. My first thought was that he was asking for money, so I told him that I had no cash. He was very clean looking though and well groomed, so I thought that it was kind of odd that he'd be asking for money. He repeated that he just needed help with the gas, and kind of motioned to the pump. The whole situation just felt weird. He never asked for money, just kept saying help with gas, and it was at that moment that I started to think that he was actually wanting me to go to his side of the pump. He was parked in a way that the van doors were right next to the pump, and he made a point not to stand in front of them. I also noticed that he was positioned in a way that he would likely have been blocked by any cameras, and at that moment I knew that he was trying to steal my card or grab me, I think, and I would have been completely blocked from any cameras, and we were far enough away from other people and next to a busy highway that no one would have heard me if I yelled. Honestly, I was almost thinking that I was kind of just being a jerk and that what if he really did need help? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt wrong. I took 2 steps back in the end, making it obvious that I was putting distance between us, and flat out said no, and went back to looking at my pump. Any guilt that I did feel instantly vanished when he got back into his van and drove away. Mind you, there were still half a dozen people on the other side that he could have asked. He could have gone inside to ask someone there for help, so why only ask one person and then leave? I'm convinced that it was a grab-and-go attempt that failed, and so he bailed before any more attention was on him. I can't think of any other reason, especially if he needed to gas up a van. Why waste gas driving away before exhausting your chances of asking other people? And I know that he didn't come to me last because I watched him pull in. Now, I do know that there's a chance that he could have really needed help and I was just being a jerk. But as a lone woman, I'd rather be a jerk than dead. I'm posting this here as a PSA in a sense. If you're out and about on your own, do not put yourself in situations where you are alone. I have always tried to go to the quiet, empty places because I hate crowds, but I can see how that can be dangerous. Just bite the bullet and deal with the crowd is my advice. The more witnesses, the less likely someone will try something like this. About 10 years ago, I, a 17-year-old female at the time, had just got out of a really abusive relationship. I won't get into it, but it was a bad situation. He threatened my life, and I shrugged it off, to be honest. I'm still not sure if it was the individual who was involved, but it would make sense if it was. So my father is a tradesman and used to store an assortment of ladders beside our home. We lived in a 2-story home in a suburban neighborhood, and my room used to be on the 2nd floor. One night, shortly after the breakup, I woke up late at night and heard strange noises outside. It was a windy winter night, and I live in a place where the winds can get pretty strong, so I didn't think much of the few knocks or scratches against the house. I woke up in the morning and I went to open the curtains to let some light into my room, and that was when I noticed a perfectly cut square out from my window screen. Shivers instantly ran down my spine. I always wonder about what would have possibly happened if my window wasn't locked that night. I was paranoid for a long time after that too. Also, a couple of years later, I received a phone call from an inmate from a prison, and the automated request recording included my ex's name. I didn't answer for obvious reasons, but that was the last that I've heard from him. When I was in high school, my mother was married to a man named Donald. Now, Donald was a drunk. He worked a good job and made some good money too, so he provided for us well enough. But he filled his free time chugging vodka like water in his underwear on the couch. Donald wasn't always aggressive when he drank. However, after a day at work, he would come home, drink a bottle, and try to pick fights with me for anything that he could think of. Very often, these fights would turn physical, and while I was no lightweight, in high school on the first occasion that I fought back, he called the cops on me. As a result of this situation, once he was about 3/4 of the way through a bottle, my mother took to packing an overnight bag, having me load up and going to stay in a hotel for the night. I always stayed in the same hotel just down the street from my house, since it would allow me to go back home before school the next morning, after Donald had left for work to get ready. It was a nice place with a huge open foyer that all of the rooms surrounded, going up about 5 stories. I knew the ladies at the desk really well, as I was there 5 to 6 times a month as well. And on this occasion in question, I had gone over fairly late in the evening. The hotel had 24-hour booking at the front desk, but the girl behind the desk mentioned that they were booked up for the night. I breathed an exasperated sigh as I relayed the news and mentioned that I would just catch a bus a little ways uptown to go to another hotel. The girl behind the desk mentioned that there was one room that she could put me in, at a discounted rate no less. She was, however, hesitant to do so, saying that the owner of the hotel had taken it out of service for reasons unknown to her, but that she knew that I would be gone before the owner would arrive in the morning, and she could fudge it into the system to look like the room hadn't been occupied. I thanked her for this and accepted, not caring for the other options that I had available to me at the time. So I got the key and I went into the room, got undressed, showered, and settled into bed. I noticed too that despite her reservations, the room was immaculate. I simply couldn't fathom why a perfectly good room like this wasn't being rented out, but decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. The room was pretty standard as far as hotel rooms go, I suppose. A single queen-sized bed, a TV on the wall to your left, a desk to your right, a mirrored closet door across from the bed with a table next to it, and a ceiling fan just past the foot of the bed. I must have fallen asleep sometime around 11 o'clock to the sound of the TV playing. Some late night cop drama, I think. Quite comfortable in bed. Until around 2:30 in the morning. I wasn't awoken by a sound as much as a lack of sound, I think. You never realize just how jarring silence is, too, until it occurs suddenly in the night like this. As I sort of rolled to sit up, I took note of the time on the alarm clock and noticed that the TV had turned off. The room was illuminated by the light of the parking lot pouring in through the blinds, and as my vision sharpened a bit and the room properly came into focus, it was then that I noticed that I was not alone in the room. At the foot of the bed was a woman. She was wearing a hotel bathrobe. Her hair was darkened by water as if she had just gotten out of the shower, and notably, she was quite tall too. The top of her head was just 2 feet or so below the ceiling fan. She just stood at the foot of the bed with her head cocked to one side and stared at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't move either. At some point during this exchange, I convinced myself that I was just dreaming, and there was no woman in my room. So despite her standing there staring at me, I wasn't really afraid, I guess. You see, I'd had some hyper-realistic dreams before, when I was a kid after all. So I simply laid back down on my back and watched her stand there, my head tilted so that I could keep an eye on her, knowing that if I waited, she would simply disappear. And eventually she did, which gave me confirmation that it was just one of those terrible, hyper-realistic dreams. I fell back asleep, and I slept through to my morning wake-up call. Now, the lady at the front desk sounded a bit nervous when she called, so I quickly got dressed and headed out to the front desk, thinking that her boss may be coming by sooner than expected or something. And I was not expecting the conversation that I had at the front desk as I checked out. When I walked up, she started apologizing to me. I was confused, so I sort of calmed her down and asked her to explain what had her so stressed out. She took a deep breath and said, "I found out why that room was taken out of service. I came to find out, 2 weeks before I stayed in that room, a woman had stayed there while on vacation with her husband and 2 kids. She stayed behind while they went to grab breakfast one morning, and she took a shower, put on her bathrobe, and, well, hung herself from the ceiling fan with a bedsheet. Her husband found her there when he got back. The room was removed from a service as a matter of good taste until the services were held, and I didn't know any of this beforehand, and it definitely makes me wonder, did I actually see her in my room that night, or was it really just a coincidental dream?" Back when I was younger, I lived in a really big house, and in my room, there was always this dark, dusty closet that I never used. To get to it, you had to crawl through a small door about a little smaller than half the size of a normal door, and I never went in there for a reason. For one, the room was covered in child's drawings all over, words, pictures, and other disturbing and unexplainable stuff that I don't really want to talk about right now, but the quick note is that I was not like 16 in this story. I was like 8 or 9, so I was young. For the first 2 years in the house, nothing ever really happened though. It was peaceful, but eventually we had to take off the door for a reason that I forget. But when my dad first took the door off, it was fine. Sure, it smelled a little bit dusty in my room, but nothing really happened. However, that night I just couldn't sleep for some reason, and all I could smell was this terrible smell of something rotting. I kept smelling this too for another 3 nights, and I didn't want to tell my parents as they were busy all the time while this was happening, so it would just be a hassle for them, and I knew that. But I could only ever smell the rotting during the night, so I decided to go and take a look for what it could be. I looked all over my room and found nothing, and the last place to check was the closet. And inside, there was a pile of dead, rotting rats, at least 8 of them. I screamed and my parents ran in, Eventually, they cleaned up the rats, confused on how they had actually gotten in there. And to be honest, we all thought that this was the end of it. But the next night, I was hearing creaking floorboards and something sort of, I don't know, like mushy moving in my room. I tried to ignore it, but couldn't fall asleep. And the next morning, I found all of my dolls had black paint on them and holes in their faces. I ran to my parents asking if they did it, and they said no. I asked my cousin, as she had been over a few days before, and she said no. I didn't really have friends at the time because we lived in the middle of nowhere, so there was really nobody else that could have done it. The next morning, I had a smudge of black paint on my face. Our paint is still in boxes in the storage room, mind you, so I was really confused by that. Once I got the paint off, I realized that underneath the paint, I was also bleeding a little bit. Not a terrible amount, but more than the amount from a paper cut for sure. The next night, I decided to go into the closet, and I found a small whiteboard with a heart on it. And that, for whatever reason, was the last night that I ever heard stuff from in there. It was weird and uncomfortable, and for all I know, it could have been a prank, but there were some things that I don't think that you would do in a prank, like make me bleed at night. Either way, I just recently remembered this, and I just wanted to share it with all of you guys. It's a really weird part of my life and a strange story, I know that, but I don't know. What do you guys think it was? When I was younger and just got into online college, I got my first apartment. I had 3 jobs and one was third shift, but I was more than ready for the independence, so I didn't mind. While I had a great time there, I did have one problem though, my new downstairs neighbor. So the other tenants are a bit older than I am, with one of them being an old man who lived there for like 20 years. The other was an older woman with a small kid, probably been there for 3 to 4 years, and an empty apartment downstairs. I keep to myself pretty much, so I never really spoke to any of them before, until I noticed that there was a new move-in, a man that seemed close to my age, maybe a little bit older, black, greasy hair and a little overweight, but in my experience of living here, people seemed nice enough, and I was happy to possibly have someone to say hello to. That possibility turned sour though really quick when a casual hello turned into "that trash stinks" remarks from him when I was taking out the trash, and other snide remarks under his breath when I've done nothing, even remarking on my sister's lack of a bra when she came to visit me. Naturally, I was grossed out and annoyed that he had to comment on anyone, especially my sister, and told the landlord. Nothing came of it, of course, but one day I was asleep and someone came banging on my door. I had no idea who it was, and my anxiety was beyond strong. I'm alone and never expect a knock that wasn't planned, so it was weird, but it was the neighbor saying that I was being too loud and I need to stop harassing him. I explained through a closed door that I was asleep and that I was not making any noise. He left and stomped down the stairs while muttering and calling me names. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest though, and I went back to bed, only to hear him coming back up the stairs and bang on my door again. When I addressed him again, he said that I was harassing him and that he's calling the cops because I'm still making noise. I told him to ask the other neighbor because there's no way that I could possibly be making noise when he's on the other side of the building. He thanks me politely before stomping off and cursing and calling me names yet again. I tell the landlord right away that one of his tenants is acting hostile, and I don't feel comfortable or safe, and he tells me that he'll look into it. I hear nothing, though, for a whole week. But it turns out that it was the old neighbor hitting the floor with a stick like one of those classic cartoons because the rude neighbor was playing music too loud. I swear that he should have known that too, as I'm on the other side of the building. It was like he wanted an excuse to come and speak to me almost. Anyway, the following months it got even worse, and one day I walked out in a snowsuit so that I can play in the snow, big kid at heart, He had to remark on my clothing being unnecessary, even when there's 3 feet of snow out. I forgot what I said in response, something like it's not his business, but he basically just swore at me. I just walked off to go and play in the snow. It gave me little enjoyment because of the earlier interaction, so in the end I just went back home to get ready for work. The snowstorm, it got worse though, and I had just come back home from my night shift. I see him alone in the parking lot with the car on and the windows up. I was on high alert as I carefully walked around and up the alley to my apartment. But the second that I closed the door to go upstairs, I hear loud, wall-shaking music. It's him. He's blasting his car music at max volume in a snowstorm at 3 in the morning. I was surprised and confused because what was his reasoning? He did it until 8 o'clock in the morning, and I found out later that it was to spite the old neighbor for telling him his music was too loud. Soon, it all started getting pretty serious though. Cursing in the hallway and playing the music louder, with the police knocking at our doors asking us about a noise disturbance, and now a mutual hatred amongst the neighbors as this guy who just kept us all up all night. But that's not the worst part of it. You see, I just got back home from my night shift and it's 3 in the morning yet again. I'm dragging my tired feet over to the mailboxes that are right inside the townhouse's door, and as I'm looking through the ads and the letters, his door opens at the top of the stairs. My stomach tightens, hoping that I don't have to interact with him, but drops when he starts speaking unintelligibly. At the top of the stairs, he's gurgling and mumbling something. I asked him what, but he repeats the same weird sounds again, only more aggressive. I felt something was more than off at this point, and I noped right around and out the door heading back to my car. I thought to myself that I would rather sleep in my car than possibly be attacked in the hallway, and as I'm having this thought, I hear the window above slam open. I freeze and then spin back around to the edge of the corner, and it's him. He's looking for me out of the window. I stand there for a moment listening to him, and he's speaking gibberish and yelling. I thought to myself that this was my chance to sneak upstairs, past his door and into my apartment. I quickly sped up the stairs and past his door to the second flight of the stairs, and right as I reached the top of the second flight of the stairs, his door swings open with a big slam that makes me jump, and I hear him muttering and gibberishly speaking loudly while walking up the stairs. My heart is beating out of my ribcage as I'm simultaneously walking and fishing my keys out of my bag. Like a classic horror movie, I kept fumbling the keys, looking for the correct one in the dark hallway as I hear him walking up the last couple of steps. I'm mentally telling myself not to panic as I spot the correct key and slide it into the hole on the first go. I swing the door open and practically launch myself inside before slamming it shut behind me. I pause and hold my breath as I hear him just 5 feet from my door, muttering gibberish and calling me names again, before walking back down the stairs and out of the building. I watched him through a crack in my window, blind, sort of pacing back and forth, muttering, cursing, and at one point screaming before walking off into the night. With a little bit of relief, I head to bed hoping that he doesn't come back. The next day, I get a text from the landlord, and he says that apparently this guy got arrested and won't be coming back. Seems he was off his meds again, and attaches a link in the text. Of course, I raised an eyebrow to that comment, thinking, now you tell me. But the link showed that there was a mugshot of him and a description of his nightly activity, to include stealing from a turkey hill, threatening cops that he's going to shoot them, punching one of them, and previous to all of this said, earlier in the night when he dropped his pants and rubbed himself against a window, then ran down the town square while yelling and screaming. I never did see him again, just his family coming in and moving his stuff out. But, man, I am so glad that I got into that door that night, because if I hadn't, I shudder to think what might have happened. This experience took place in the spring of '77 when I was 5 years old. My mother had a friend named Nikki who had invited us to spend the weekend at her house. Vicky's house was not some rundown, obviously haunted home that you would expect for a story like this. It was actually a newer two-story build that was less than 10 years old. While the house did not give off any weird vibes, I remember that Vicky wasn't exactly the nicest woman either, and always seemed to be giving my sister and I trouble, like she was thinking we were going to damage something by being kids. Anyway, in Vicky's basement she had one of those hanging half-basket wicker chairs that were popular in the 70s. I was down in the basement sitting on this chair, being very careful as I didn't want to give Vicky another reason to tell me off, when suddenly the chain or the rope that fastened the chair to the ceiling broke and it fell forward on the open side, trapping me inside of it like a cage. At the same time that I fell to the floor, Vicky's stereo suddenly turned on by itself and started playing very loud music. I was utterly terrified and screamed for my mother. My mother and Vicky came rushing down the stairs and my mum got me out from under the chair while Vicky shut the stereo off. Vicky then started laying into me for breaking the chair and playing with the stereo, but my mum told her to shut it. We left shortly afterwards when I had calmed down too. But to this day, I can vividly remember the feeling of terror as that chair fell on top of me and the stereo just came on loudly like that. When I brought it up to my mum years later, she remembered the incident and took us home because she didn't think it was possible for me to turn on the stereo and managed to break the chair in the time that it took between the stereo coming on and me screaming for her. It was basically instantaneous, is what she said. She thought Vicky was acting terribly the entire time and yelling at me for the incident was the last straw, and we never went back to Vicky's again after that. I can't say that I'm at all heartbroken about it either. There was something weird about that house, and I don't know, I just felt like something was in it and it didn't like me for whatever reason, and it wasn't just Vicky. So this evening I had an experience with something that's followed my wife and I through several moves that we've come to terms with, knowing that it's attached to either of us or something that we own, and that it's going to keep following us unless we do something to get rid of it. We simply call it the Pika, but the Pika is of unknown origin. For as long as my wife and I have been living together, 2012, we've had experiences with it too. Starting off, while we were just dating, neither of us told the other that we saw it. You know, not wanting to sound too crazy to the other. We've both had paranormal experiences separately before we got together, but it wasn't until we moved in together that things escalated a bit. We realized that the house that we were living in was haunted by more than one thing, and slowly we talked more and more about those things, and we were having matching experiences. It was great to feel validated, I guess you could say, that somebody else saw and felt and experienced the same crazy moments, but also mildly frightening because, you know, like ghosts and stuff. Well, anyway, the Pika got its name from what it does. For the most part, it's a shadowy silhouette of a person that we would catch peeking around corners or from behind furniture through windows and doorways, etc., before ducking out of view just as you turn to look at it. It doesn't always duck out of view fast enough though, and we see glimpses of it. One of its best tricks is when it peeks out at you from a mirror, like the mirror is really just another window or something. That always gives me a good scare as well. What's also been validating is that our dog has reacted to it as well on several occasions, as well as the pets of some of our roommates that we've had over the years. Through several years of different apartments and different rented homes, it's come along with us to all of them. And because it just gives us a bit of a jump scare and hasn't tried to harm us in any way, we've just sort of cohabited with it, I guess you could say. Well, tonight is the first time that it has severely shocked and scared me, though. I was watching a show on Netflix called The Midnight Club. Pretty decent series, by the way. And I've got the lights low in the room to add to the fright factor. My wife is watching something else in another room, so it's just me, my snacks, and my comfy recliner while I'm watching. Things are getting a little intense, and I'm sort of subconsciously rocking my chair ever so slightly. The episode's gotten to a pretty visually dark scene, so I can faintly see myself in the chair that I'm in reflecting in the low light of the screen. And that was when I see a silhouette moving, rising from behind and to the right of me. As soon as I start to turn to look, I see two large, very not shadow white hands grab the side of my seat, forcibly stop my rocking, pulling the chair back, and thrust its face around the back of the chair to just inches from mine before disappearing into nothingness. That was the most physical experience that I've had with the Pika or anything, and probably any other paranormal entity that I've come into contact with as well. Not only was it very up close and personal with me, but it grabbed my seat, stopped my rocking, and jerked the seat back. Needless to say, I stopped my show and turned the lights on while I mentally processed what the heck just happened. Then, I detailed everything out to my wife before sharing it with all of you guys here. Anyway, I really don't know what to do from here. It seems like whatever this is getting worse, and I don't understand why. What do you guys think that I should do, and have any of you guys had anything similar happen? If you have, I would love to know that I'm not alone. So, for context, this encounter takes place at the 140-year-old church that I worked at as a pastor. Apparently, when the second floor was built in 1976, a worker fell through the roof and landed on a girl who was sitting in a pew at service one day, where both of them died. Since I work as one of the two pastors, I have to go to the church every late Saturday night to prepare the church at the same time as the cleaning crew. I used to not believe in ghosts, that is, until these encounters convinced me otherwise. Anyway, the first story isn't really too freaky, but it's worth mentioning because, well, it'll make sense for the other stories. So, down in the basement of the church, there's this weird storage room area, accessed by a padlock. In this room, there are doors leading to other rooms, including the water heater and the piping. One of these rooms leads to this hallway about 5 feet wide and 40 feet long. This whole hallway is filled with old chairs and pews, and one day I went down there to grab a chair because one of the chairs upstairs broke, and at the other end of the hallway, there is just a man standing there. Now, here's the weird thing. The only way in and out of that room is through the locked door to the hallway, which only the staff members and I know the code to. He didn't look like a staff member, and unless he climbed over the chairs, there's really no natural way that he could have gotten to the end of the hallway. I called out to him, and then he just vanished. I later checked the security camera footage. There's a camera in every room because of a lot of recent robberies, and he had been there since the start of the footage, which was at 8 p.m. the day before when motion was detected. I didn't open the door until around 9:30 p.m. the day after the motion was detected, so it made no sense. Now, in this next encounter, it was with the same man, but something else was involved too. This takes place on the second floor and a few weeks after the previous encounter that I explained. I was there at around 10:20 in the morning preparing for church service, which starts at 11, and I had to grab something from the kids' art storage room. When I first got upstairs, I saw that same man standing in the room at the end of the hallway. I went over, and when I got within 5 feet of the room, he vanished again. I went into the room, and then as I walked in, I heard what sounded like a little girl who had whispered the words, "You're mine," and the door started to slowly close and the lights started flickering. Let's just say, too, that this terrified me enough that I darted out of that room, which I'm pretty fast when I'm scared, and I literally jumped down most of the steps on the stairs and ran outside. Later that night, when I arrived at the church to clean, I looked up into the top floor window and I saw a little girl up there and a man standing at the window. They both smiled and waved at me, and then they vanished. After I saw that, I decided to head home after asking the cleaning crew to finish up, and I promised myself not to ever go back to the church at night, ever again. Now, these stories are creepy and all, but what I think is the most creepiest part is that nobody else in the church has had any experiences like this. Most of the people have heard the casual footsteps in the attic, which is unreachable for safety reasons, but Nothing ever like this. So this happened last summer, late July, and it was me, my sister, and our cousins on their farm. We were sitting in the UTV with one of my cousins driving alongside the cornfield. We weren't going all that fast, so the noise coming from the vehicle wasn't that loud. And that's when we heard what sounded like either my uncle or my dad's voice coming from the direction of the field. But at that point in the year, the corn was above our heads, so we really couldn't see anything. I told my cousin to stop driving for a second and asked if everyone heard that. They all nodded their heads and said what they heard, and we all heard the same sentence. I forgot what it was now because it's been so long, but it was something along the lines of "come back" or "where are you going" or something like this, which was strange because we were already far enough along the trail that no one would be near. The closest neighbor was on the complete opposite side that we were, and what really made us scared was that both of our dads had left a few minutes ago, so there was no chance that they would have been out there. Anyways, because we were all so shaken up from that, we turned back and went inside to ask if it was possible that our dads had come back already, or if they had left later than we had thought or something. And they were definitely not at the property during whatever happened. This confirmed it for us, and my cousin went and got his gun and some other weapons for us to go back and investigate. We spent probably 30 minutes back there trying to find a source for what happened, but we didn't find anything. I've heard other stories too of people hearing voices of other people they know, or even themselves coming from another room or something when nobody's actually there. And I'm wondering if this could have been, well, one of those instances. What do you guys think? This happened 7 years ago, but I still remember the fear, and I feel like it was just yesterday. When I was in my early 20s, I worked the night shift at a bakery making the donuts. I really loved that job too. 3 nights of the week I would be with my co-worker, and 2 nights I would work alone. It was summertime and we were having some problems with the AC, so the maintenance guy, Andy, came at night when I was on the clock to work on it. The bakery was small and crowded during the day, so it was best for him to come when it was pretty much empty. Management always let me know when Andy would be there, so it was never a surprise. At first, too, he was very pleasant, and I had no issues sharing space with him as we worked. One evening, though, this changed. My one co-worker was a little bit late. She said that she lost track of time in the shower, so Andy piped in saying we should all shower together to save time, and starts laughing at that. It was a bit creepy. I also had stated that I lived alone, with his response being, "Good, I have you to myself then." And after this night, I realized that Andy wasn't the kind of guy that I thought that he was. I stopped speaking to him unless I had to, and before long the AC was repaired, and I thought that I was free from him. Fast forward to a night a few weeks later, I'm working alone. It's 2 in the morning and I'm trying donuts when I hear all of a sudden a loud banging on the front window. Startled, I look up and see who else but Andy. He's calling my name and asking to be let in. No one had said anything to me about him coming that night. Andy then starts pulling on the front door handles. Luckily it's locked, but man, he became pretty aggressive. I run into a corner of the bakery where he can't see me and try calling my manager with no response. The phone starts ringing and I can see the caller ID from where I'm sitting, and it's Andy. He's being relentless and won't stop banging on the window and trying to pry the door open. My fear is rising now, so I dial 911. The cops arrive within 10 minutes and search Andy's vehicle, and in the back seat, they find duct tape, a knife, and rope. Apparently, they can't really do much though because, well, he hasn't harmed me or whatever. Andy told the police that he was there to fix the AC, but my manager calls me back in the morning and tells me that the AC is working fine and they never asked Andy to come out. So, whatever Andy had planned that night, whatever he was there for, I know one thing for sure, it wasn't the air conditioning. Last night, and I'm a 22-year-old female, and my husband, 25-year-old male, woke me up at around 11:50 to tell me that someone has been knocking on our door and ringing our apartment doorbell for about 10 minutes on and off. He woke me so that I could possibly ID the person. Once I looked out of our upstairs apartment window, I saw the man walking to his car in our apartment parking lot. It's across the street from our unit. He was wearing blue jeans and a grey t-shirt. He was a medium build, I suppose. Possibly 30 years old, a blonde man. He wasn't covering his face or anything too, but the thing is that he was carrying what looked like resistance bands or a rope or something. He sat in his car for about 3 minutes while I was on the phone with dispatch. Then he came back to our door and knocked hard for another few minutes. Dispatch advised me that police were on their way and they hung up. It was at this point that I started videoing the vehicle. I read out the tag number and make and model and just watched as he put the car in park and reverse over and over again. Out of seemingly nowhere too, he backed out of the parking lot and started rushing away, but not before the officer arrived and pulled him over. My downstairs neighbor knocked on my door and told me that he had been peering into her little children's window and was pounding on her door as well. She said that her husband had left only 1 minute before he started knocking at her door. She said that he saw her children through the window and that's why he seemed to continue knocking. Our doors are right next to one another, so he probably didn't know what door he wanted opened. He was watching us as well through our upstairs windows, so I turned all the lights out and shut the blinds while I called dispatch. The police never contacted us for a statement. I've reached out to dispatch about an update and I'm waiting to see if any action was taken. We're keeping our eyes peeled to see if he's been following us or anything. I'm replacing my porch light bulbs with motion detectors and putting bars in our windows and door tracks and stuff. My neighbor and our families are pretty panicked, to say the least, because he was outside for about 25 to 30 minutes and that shows a lot of determination to get in, right? I'm still waiting on a call from the responding officer. I have his badge number and name, so if they don't reach out to me today or tonight, he might work third shift apparently. I'll call the substation. If they didn't do anything, I'll go ahead and make a suspicious persons case for the paper trail. We've had no odd encounters any other night. However, while I was looking at the video that I took, I remembered that car. I was walking my dog at 8 p.m. about a week ago for him to go pee, and this car was driving really slow through the parking lot and parked a few spots down from where I was letting my dog sniff. They just seemed to sit there with the car running, and when I tell you my ears started ringing and I got an awful feeling, I'm not joking. In fact, it got so bad that I just turned around and went home. I didn't even give my dog a chance to pee, and I shut every door and window. I think that this man has been staking out our apartment building for some time now, me and my neighbors. And I think that he wanted to get in where those children are. So I was sat in my friend's bedroom in the new house his family had just built, on the side of the old barn. We had the windows open, and a soft breeze and the distant sounds of people in the park were drifting through. We were watching movies, eating snacks, having a lazy summer holiday afternoon. There was nothing eerie or scary about any of it. No scary films, no talking of anything of the sort. But in between films, my friend got up to replenish the snacks while I was changing the disc. He called my name from the door, and I was turning to answer when I felt a distinct, unmistakable sensation of like an ice-cold hand tightening on my neck. I dropped the DVD case as my hands instinctively flew up to my throat to pull his hand away, but of course, my friend wasn't there. In fact, nobody was there. But this hand, it had completely restricted my breathing and I couldn't take a breath. My friend ran over in a panic and led me to the sofa to sit down while I was gasping for air, utterly terrified. He kept saying, just breathe, while he fumbled for his phone and started dialing 999, which is like our 911 here in England. Then, on and off with the just breathes, I was suddenly able to take a breath. It probably lasted less than a minute, but man, I just broke down shaking and crying. I still have no idea what that was, but it felt like someone had grabbed my throat and was just strangling me. To this day, it's the only unexplainable thing that's ever really happened to me as well. I've always been enthralled by ghost stories and the tales of the unexplained, but this is my only real-life experience that I know of. I have no medical conditions or allergies or anything like that. Nothing has developed in the 2 decades since this happened either. Nothing that could really explain what caused this freak incident. And when I asked my friend about it years later, he said it looked like a ghost walked through me or something. Not that he saw a ghost, but the terror on my face and how I turned sheet white and just froze like that, he said that it's something that will live with him forever. So this happened years ago when I just moved to a new town for school. I lived with my second aunt for the first 2 months, but we had totally different lifestyles, and I decided that it would be better if I just move out. I didn't have a lot of money, so I was initially willing to share rent with somebody. Fast forward a week and still nothing. One day I had 2 appointments in the same area, at 7 and 8 p.m, the other end of town, but the district was quite decent and not cheap. Mum was against me going there alone and so late, but I just didn't really have a choice. I arrived at the metro station in advance because I had to walk 15 minutes from there to get to the first apartment complex. The road to the complex was dark, surrounded by not-so-nice-looking buildings and almost deserted. Definitely not what I expected from the area at all. Out of nowhere, though, a guy approached me. He was about my age, tall, wore glasses, and had a kind of nerdy and intelligent look to him, I guess. Also out of nowhere, he stated that I must be a domestic violence victim and need help. I was so taken aback that I didn't even know what to say to that. He said that he could help. He has all the resources and I shouldn't be afraid to talk to him. I finally gained back the ability to speak and firmly told him that I'm not experiencing any DV and I don't need any help. He continued, "You shouldn't be afraid of your husband. There are shelters for women that you can temporarily stay in. I'm a psychologist and I help women like you. Does he beat you? Assault you verbally? You don't have to put up with that, you know. One word and I get social workers involved and you'll never see him again." I was shocked that anybody could assume that I was married because at the time I never even had a boyfriend. It lasted for about 5 to 7 minutes. I kept on walking. He kept on talking. Doesn't matter how many times I told him that I don't need any help. He encouraged me to open up and not to feel afraid to tell that I wanted to be rescued from my abusive husband. There was just no way to tell him that I didn't even have a husband. He seemed to be convinced that I was a DV victim. I even considered yelling at him, but he was just so polite, well articulated, and honestly, listening to him, I could believe that he was working with DV victims, because, weird coincidence, but that's exactly what my mum's job is, and I'm quite familiar with the terms and techniques that he was using. Honestly, he didn't seem intimidating, and I wasn't scared by his presence or weird assumptions. Just it was so bizarre and out of place that I merely wanted him to leave me alone and wondered if he was going to walk me all the way to the apartment complex. And if so, what happens if he mistakes my potential landlord that was already waiting for me at the porch for my abusive husband? Thankfully, though, he left earlier. He tried to give me his business card as a last attempt to save me. I firmly denied again, and finally he walked away. I got to the apartment. Long story short, didn't like it. Was too expensive, not really worth the price, plus the weird guy that most likely lived nearby and all that. But the second appointment was 20 minutes from there, and I liked the neighborhood much more. Well lit, felt safer, lots of shops, people walking by. I got to the building 30 minutes early and decided to walk around, check out the porch that I have to wait on for the girl that I need to talk to. Then, the second encounter happened. 2 people, a guy and a girl, exited the porch. I meet the guy's eyes for a brief moment, and he stops completely, looking at me in some kind of awe, or I don't know how to describe it, to be honest. I thought maybe he recognized me from somewhere at first, but it seemed unlikely. I didn't know anyone in this city, except for my aunt and classmates, and he wasn't any of them. I'd never met him before, in fact. So I made sure it was the porch that I needed, texted the girl who was supposed to show me her apartment, and she replied back that she was going to be late. Great, I thought. I started walking around the courtyard back and forth, still feeling the guy's eyes on me. He was standing nearby talking to the girl that he exited the porch with. His head slightly moved as I moved across the courtyard. Finally, I got tired of it, and I decided to check if he's really following me everywhere that I go. I chose a moment when he wasn't looking at me and made a run, getting behind the building and hid in a bush. And 1 minute later, I see him. He gets behind the building too, but isn't able to find me. Then he literally stands on his tiptoes, slowly moving his head to the right, to the left, trying to spot me, it seems. His lips are moving too, and I hear, "Where is she?" I felt goosebumps all around my body. He left. I still stayed and waited for the girl to come, because I was afraid that she'd give me a bad review on a site that we were using, but even after we finally met, she said that she forgot the keys and we need to wait for the other flatmate. We sat on a bench, chit-chatting for another 30 minutes, and only then walked to the building. And there was the guy with this girl again, still standing. I saw his eyes practically burning a hole in me this time, and he smiled, or rather grinned widely, and with some kind of evil pleasure almost. I still remember his grin because I've never seen anything like that. We walked past him, and my potential flatmate showed me the apartment, although at that moment I already knew that we weren't going to live together, which was a pity because I really liked the place, but oh well. That guy, with him being there on the same porch, chances are that he lived there too. Honestly, I don't remember what happened in the apartment because it was years ago. Something tells me I asked the girls that lived there about this guy, but I don't think that their reply was of significance. They either brushed it off and I decided not to push it, or I never asked them in the first place. I also don't remember if I saw him when I was exiting the building, but I know for a fact that nobody followed me to the metro station, and I've never seen this guy again. I don't know what his deal was, and I'm not sure if I want to. I also never returned to that cursed area as of now. But it was weird. 2 really eerie and creepy encounters in one night. I don't know if I was being set up, or if something else was going on, or if it was just a really strange coincidence, but something tells me that there was a plan there that day, that multiple people may have been involved, and that somehow my ability to get away from these people at just the right time may have saved me from something that day. What that is, I still don't know. This all happened when I was 6 years old, and I still remember it so vividly. Just to preface this too, I'm open to the idea of the paranormal, but for the most part, I'm still a bit of a skeptic. I'm one of those I wouldn't be surprised if ghosts really existed, but for now, I don't think that they do sort of people. I believe that there's an explanation for pretty much any paranormal experience that we face, whether it's simple or complicated. So, my parents had immigrated from Vietnam in the 80s and did the whole Ellis Island immigration process. They've lived all over the country, but fast forward to 1993, where they had me in California. In 1999, my family was pretty poor and decided that we wanted to try and get a place with my cousin's family, my dad's brother's family. They went searching for a house in Sacramento, California. They found a place that was oddly cheap. If I can recall correctly too, it was a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom house with a gated automatic fence. This was really fancy back then too, and it was a decently sized lot. Now, here are the details that were told to me later in life when I got older and spoke to my parents about the house. There was obviously a catch to the low price point to this house, and the offering price was due to the fact that it was known to be haunted. The real estate agent was very upfront about this too, and mentioned the history of the house. The original owner of this home died in the nursery of the house. The nursery was located underneath the stairs, I think sort of Harry Potter cupboard style, but much bigger and is actually a room. We're unsure of what the owner died from, but my parents didn't think that this was necessary to know or even remember. My dad and his brother were skeptics at the time and were only interested in the price point really. The real estate agent mentioned that there have been many families that have lived here that experienced paranormal activity and moved out fairly quickly. But this didn't stop them from taking the offer. There were many things that we experienced in this house. Some very typical, such as creaky pipes or wood, extreme sudden cold temps, footsteps, stuff like that. However, I'd like to just share what I deem to be, well, the creepiest moments. Although it was a 5-bedroom house, we had to share rooms due to 2 families living in this house. I shared a room with 2 of my cousins, both around my age, and one of the nights I remembered, this was a couple of weeks living here and we were already experiencing creepy things. I really needed a drink of water. We had a pact that if we ever went somewhere in the middle of the night, we would wake each other up and go together. So I woke up my cousins and told them to come with me to get a drink of water really quick. We had an uncle that stayed with us at that time too. He's that uncle that goes from family to family to squat for as long as he can, and he still does this to this day. He would stay anywhere he possibly could pretty much. And well, he didn't mind taking the nursery. Obviously, when we were kids, our parents didn't inform us of any of the paranormal talk that they had. All of our experiences were discovered on our own pretty much. So, as we walked down the stairs, we could hear our uncle groaning in his sleep, almost as though he was in pain. Well, we sat on the stairs and continued to listen, and we were trying to make out what he was trying to say. We noticed that the name Sam kept coming up, so we got our water and we just went back to sleep. The next day we brought up what we heard our uncle said to our parents and told them that he kept saying the name Sam. My parents sort of looked at us in terror. Then they tried to play it off and said that it was nothing to be concerned about. And I mean, we were kids, but we definitely knew that they were hiding something from us. But we pretty much just moved on from it. When we were older, though, and talked about this incident, our parents finally told us the truth about that time. My parents told me and my siblings, and I eventually told my cousins, who had already been told by their parents as well. But apparently, Sam is the name of the original owner that passed away in that nursery. They had not at all informed my uncle about the name of the owner. They confronted my uncle, in fact, and he had no idea what they were talking about. This sent chills up my spine, even so many years after the experience. But here is the last experience that was pretty much the okay, we're moving out motive. So, after maybe 4 or 5 months, we had Lunar New Year's party, and typically these drinking parties will go on all night, and it usually ends up into a sort of mellow talk to each other in the living room gathering to the end of night sort of thing. It was probably 1 a.m. at this point, and the people that were left were all in the living room at the base of the stairs. Everyone was pretty much accounted for, but as the night was dying down, everyone was chatting, and suddenly we hear the doors, and maybe the windows too, start to slam shut upstairs one by one. This lasted maybe 10 seconds. It almost didn't sound real because, I don't know, it seemed like there were more doors and windows shutting than we even had. Silence, as we all stopped and stared at the top of the stairs, terrified. My dad and my brother started to walk up the stairs, and some of us crept behind them. They called out to see if anyone was up there, but there was no response. But here's the really scary part. Every single door was open. There wasn't a single door that was actually slammed shut at all, yet we all heard the doors shut one after the other. I remember so vividly crying my eyes out when my uncle came back and said, "All the doors are open." And after that, we moved out within the week. My parents never shared with me the address of that place. They never wanted me to look it up any further, and I don't blame them, to be honest. However, I'd really be interested in looking up more of the history of the house, I guess. I've tried Googling things such as Sam Sacramento Haunted House, but I've never found anything. I remember what the house looks like, but as extensively as I've tried to search it up, I just can't find it. I'd be interested if anyone is able to find the house that I'm looking for, and I'll give you a bit of a description of the house so that you guys can perhaps help me out. So it was a 2-story white house, very symmetrically boxy, I guess. Big 2-car garage, black gates that surrounded the house that opened up by sliding gates that led to the driveway in the garage, grass lawn with a decent-sized tree. The backyard was pretty much cement and dead grass. It was located in the middle of the suburban street, i.e. not a corner house, not in a circle or court, just a regular drive street address between two other houses. And that's pretty much it. If you know of this place, or if you could find it, then I sure would be thankful and would love to hear from you. When I was in high school, I lived in an apartment complex in Calabasas, California. It's where all the kids live that weren't filthy rich, that went to Calabasas High School or Agora High School. I became friends with most of the kids in that complex too. We would play basketball some days and on the weekends break into empty apartments and throw parties. One particular party that I was hanging out with a group I didn't know well, it was 5 other guys and 1 girl. We were smoking, drinking, and I saw the guys go into another room while the girl was standing in the kitchen drinking a beer. I get up to use the bathroom and I overhear the guy say, "We're going to get this girl." Another guy says, "We're going to run a train on her." Now, in high school, I was already a pretty big kid, 6'3" and 250 pounds. When I heard the things that they were planning on doing to her, I walked up to them and said, "You guys aren't going to do a thing like that while I'm around." They tried to convince me to join in. It would be fun, they said, and she might get into it. I left the room and told the girl and said that she should probably head home, the party's over. She left and I left shortly after too. I never did have anything else to do with those guys after that. But the kicker is that the boy that said let's run a train on her, I later found out from a mutual friend, had actually murdered his girlfriend in college and was killed in a police chase crashing his car in the median. The world is a scary place, especially for women sometimes, and I think about this even more now that I have my own daughter. So my father and uncle have a story of living as outsiders or non-natives, Caucasian, young people on the reservation. Their tale was of experiencing a skinwalker. My grandma taught school on the reservation and they lived well off compared to the natives living there. But from what I know, there's a lot of law surrounding the Navajo Nation. Non-natives, primarily older generations, keeping their experiences and stories left unspoken, especially to those not from the culture. Forgive me too if I'm mistaken in any of this, the culture, ideology, practices, or any other part. I'm just trying to tell the story that my family has only spoken to me in whispers about. My grandmother, father, and uncle lived there for a few years, and their experience was much different than the Navajo people who lived there for generations upon generations. And I just want to tell their story and get insight as to anyone else who has lived in that community and any other story some people might be willing to share. So, my father and uncle are about 2 years apart in age. They lived in Navajo Mountain in the 1980s. My dad was 10 to 12 and my uncle younger, and as it goes, they were always outside riding bikes with their friends, natives of the reservation. My grandma was recovering from an abusive relationship with their father and wasn't too concerned with their whereabouts, being it was a small community. There wasn't much trouble around, nor would they know what real trouble was at that age. Trouble wasn't the issue to young white boys on a reservation then, but pure terror was. It was a typical night, without any parental supervision. The night was colder than usual, and the night sky was blacker than you could imagine. In such a desolate place, the stars in the sky would light the night, but this night was as if the earth had moved to a different dimension, an abyss even. The boys raced each other as they did every night, until they were compelled to force their brakes in unison. They simultaneously looked up. Each boy's face melted from carefree innocent and adolescent to unadulterated horror. The boys stood motionless, grasping their bikes with every nerve, muscle, and strength in their body on the dirt road, because to the right of them was a mesa, one that they rode by every day, the mesa that paralleled from my family's home, the mesa that they could see through my father and uncle's bedroom every night. This mesa would become fear and nightmare to them from this night forward, because at the top of the mesa was a roaring fire, taller than any bonfire that someone could assemble, bigger than a group of people could assemble. It raged and was unbelievable. It was almost as tall as the Mesa itself. More unbelievable, though, was the pitch-black figure seen cavorting around the bonfire. The native boys with my father and uncle informed them that this was not a typical Navajo dance or ritual either. Pits began to form in their stomachs. Friends of my father and uncle turned back around without a word and bolted back to their homes. My father and uncle threw their bikes to the ground and ran across the unpaved road into their home. The two came back in a panic, relaying what they'd seen to my grandmother, but she was unconcerned for the most part. It was apparently a legend of the natives, she told them, and shooed them away. They laid awake all night in their shared room that night, not saying a word to one another. They forced their curtains to close as much as they could, too scared to look out the window and see what they shouldn't have to begin with. Neither could shake the images burnt into their memory, but the sun managed to rise and peek through into their entire room eventually. A sense of release washed over them as the darkness had faded. The boys left their beds and they traveled to the kitchen to try a second time to tell the grandmother what they saw that night. They tried to get a handle on what they saw, but it was as if they couldn't explain it. Again, my grandmother brushed them off. But with the coffee and newspaper more important than their story, she told them to climb the mesa to investigate. So the boys wrangled their friends who shared the experience with them that night prior as they passed on their bikes. The friends stayed on the dirt road, looking up at the mesa as my father and uncle climbed up to see any evidence of the hell-burning fire they witnessed together. The mesa wasn't much taller than an average one-story house, though, so the brothers took less than 2 minutes to climb to the top where the nightmare took place. When they got to the top, they were hysterical and also relieved. There was no indication a bonfire of that enormity, or even a fire at all, had taken place on the mesa they had already seen in the night earlier. They climbed down and told the message to the friends who had also been a part of the shocking scene. The native friends looked at them in shock, but neither said a word to them. They immediately turned their bikes around and proceeded home, and it was never talked about again despite my father and brother asking about it. My grandmother and everybody else in the community just refused to talk about it again. My father is a skeptic. He doesn't believe in anything paranormal like aliens, ghosts, mermaids, you name it, but whenever I ask about the skinwalker he saw, he always turns pale and white. He gets quiet, jumpy and curt. I had to plead to get the full story out of him, in fact, and I could see goosebumps and every hair standing up on his arms when he shared this experience. My grandma took me to Navajo Mountain in 2019 to show me her history and see how Navajo natives still live on this reservation today. According to her, not much has changed since living there in the 80s too. I hiked and explored what I could of the reservation, as to not invade or violate any of the Navajo reservation and its beauty. However, I did feel a change in mood when I visited. My existence felt, heavy, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, or as if I was invading on territory that wasn't meant for me. Not caused by any of the community there or anything, but just by my presence being on the land or something. I will never forget my experience visiting and all that I learned about the reservation life. I climbed the mesa where the skinwalker my dad and uncle had seen its ritual, and I felt pretty normal until I got to the top and stood in the middle. I know it sounds weird, but I felt a darkness creep into me as I stood there, and ever since then, I've never been the same. So my cat likes to go outside every day in the morning. He follows us to the door, takes the elevator down with us, and then goes about his day outside until we bring him back home again in the evening. Now, my cat isn't the most punctual guy, so it's pretty common for him to stay much later in the neighborhood, sometimes well into the night for several days even, or he gets bored and doesn't play for more than 2 hours and wants to get back inside. The problem is that we're not home, so he just has to wait. My family and I lived in an apartment on the first floor, so my cat's solution is to sit under one of the balconies and meow at the top of his lungs to get our attention. When we're home, it works perfectly fine, but when we're not, it's a lot less effective. So our solution was to gently ask our neighbours that have the key to our apartment to bring him up so he doesn't have to wait outside all day. Those that don't have the key sometimes let him inside the building so he's not literally outside, for example when it's raining. Our apartment is a bit special though because it's bigger than the others, so to get inside there are two ways when you get into the main hall. One takes the stairs to the left and open the door that has two locks. The second uses the elevator with the special key that goes directly inside of our apartment, and the door only has one lock. The cat is actually used to the second option, and me too because we're both lazy. But when the neighbours that don't have the key let him inside the building, he goes up the stairs and waits. And since I usually use the elevator from the parking 2 floors below, that means that I don't really see him waiting in the hall and he meows outside the door to get me to open it up for him, or my dad, or my mum. But all around we have our habits with my parents and neighbours and it works fairly well. So, now that you know how everything goes with the little guy, now we get to the good part. My parents like the outdoors very much, so I'm usually left alone in the weekends. But generally, it means just taking care of chores and inviting my friends over so that we can have the apartment to ourselves, which is pretty nice. This time I was alone. It was late, 11 p.m.ish, and I was just chilling in the living room before hearing meowing over the sound of the TV. Someone must have let my cat in the building, and he's waiting outside the door like usual. I took my keys and started opening the first lock. I don't know about other pet owners, but I know my cat meows by heart pretty much. It's kind of a rising meow that's very high-pitched and very cute, and that also has a specific sort of rhythm to it because I've been hearing it nearly every day for like 5 years. And because of this, I stopped. You see, the noise isn't what it usually is. It's like too deep and just off a bit. But this isn't my cat outside my door, and he's the only cat around that knows that he has to wait by the door and scream to be let inside. By that point, I had stopped halfway through opening the door and waited to hear him again and noticed scratching this time. But my cat never scratches the door. At that point, I'm a bit weirded out by the situation, but the meowing is getting super loud and I didn't want the neighbors to be woken up, so I continued with my key, but suddenly I heard another noise that really freaked me out. It was a cough. For the record too, I'm not a very cautious person, and in my whole 21 years of living in this apartment, I must have looked in the peephole a total of maybe, 5 times, but a small part of my brain told me to do it, and thank God that I did it that night. So, I let go of my keys and put my eye against the door, and I saw it. A man standing there, meowing at my front door. To say that I was terrified is really an understatement, but my heart pretty much stopped. I just stood there petrified for what felt like an hour. I don't really know how long it took for me to move again, but eventually my body just took over, I guess. And I did what you'd expect. I ran for my phone, stood in the corner of the living room and called the police. By the time that they got there was nobody in the front door. I can't even remember when the meowing stopped, to be honest, and they just took my testimony before telling me to be cautious and left. To this day, I still don't know what that meowing guy wanted. I'm not sure I want to know anyway, but I also don't know how he got inside the building in the first place, since you need a key to access it, and how he knows that I would open the door if he imitated my cat in front of it. Well, at least I'll be careful from now on, I suppose, and that's good, but and my cat eventually came back in since then, and he's sleeping in my bed as I'm sharing this, so there's that, I guess. This happened about 15 years ago. I was 21 years old and living in my first apartment. It was a small bachelor apartment in a pretty sketchy area. I grew up in a town that was known to be rough and tough, I guess you could say. I knew how to handle myself and learned at a young age to keep my head down and not to go looking for trouble. My apartment building was behind a bar as well. A lot of the customers of the bar would stand outside to smoke, and when they stood outside to smoke, they would be looking at my apartment pretty much all the time. Most of the people who were out smoking kept to themselves. A few would nod and say hello if I passed by. Never any issues. Well, at least until one evening. One evening I came home from work. I passed the bar like I always did and saw this extremely tall man outside smoking. As I passed, he stared at me. I gave him a slight nod, but he didn't acknowledge me. He just continued to stare, and it made me uncomfortable for sure, but I didn't think too much of it. Anyway, about an hour later, I hear a knock on my door, and it was odd because you have to buzz people into the building here. The building only had 8 units, and I didn't really know any of the neighbors, so I froze because I really didn't want to talk to anyone, but the knocking continued, and so I finally shouted out, "Who is it?" but there was no response. I shouted again, "Who's there?" and the voice said, "It's Tom." Now, I didn't know anyone named Tom, so I shouted back, "I don't know anyone named Tom. You must have the wrong apartment." The voice said, "You may not know me, but I know you. Open up so that we can talk." I went over to the peephole, and sure enough, it was that tall dude from the bar. So I loudly said, "Get out of here or I'm calling the cops." I heard his footsteps walk away, and I heard the building door open and then close, and he was gone. Or so I thought. Because a few minutes later, I peeked out the window and he was standing in the parking lot. He seemed to be talking to himself or something. At this point, obviously I'm freaking out. I called my landlord, who lived in the building next to me. He told me to call the police and that in the meantime, him and his brother would come and check things out. I call the police and tell them what's going on. They said that a car is on the way. Meanwhile, my landlord and his brother make their way to the parking lot. I watch out of my window and see them approach the tall dude. The tall dude takes one look at them and he just bolts. My landlord and his brother try to chase him, but the tall dude got away. About 5 minutes later, the police arrive. I give my version of the events and also a description of this guy, and the officer just sort of stares at me and then says, "We've had reports of a man matching that description who has been sexually assaulting women. Thank God you didn't open the door." A few days later, I get a call from the officer. He told me part of their investigation was talking to the owner of the bar, and the owner called the police when Tall Dude reappeared after a few days, and the police responded and they arrested him. Turns out, he was that guy. Now, I know that this story may sound fictional. A lot of people don't believe me when I tell it, but I can assure you that the other persons involved also witnessed what occurred that strange night. So this happened 11 years ago with my ex-girlfriend. It actually changed our relationship for the worse, and we ended up breaking up a few weeks after this too. Nonetheless, I still remember this like it was yesterday due to how unexplainable it was. My girlfriend at the time wanted to surprise me with what she said was an overnight surprise trip. I obliged and felt like I was a pretty lucky guy for her to do something that required so much planning like that. After packing a duffel bag full of clothes and toiletries, we left for what I thought was a resort or some kind of hotel stay. 2.5 hours passed when we pulled off a main road and headed down an off-road path. So I asked her if this was a camping trip and she replied yes. To be honest, I was sort of disappointed as I didn't really like camping all that much, and not to mention, I wish that I knew to pack my hiking shoes and all that. But I didn't complain, of course, because it was still a romantic gesture. 15 minutes on this rough road, we finally pulled into a camping ground. The first thing that I noticed was that there really wasn't anyone around us. It made sense, though. This was really far off the beaten path. I was actually surprised her car made it that far out considering how harsh the road was, to be honest. But anyway, we made a fire pit and she cooks dinner. Everything is going just fine and we're really feeling each other. We of course take it to the tent as the sun goes down and we're vibing off of each other, and yeah, it's what you would expect would happen as we begin moving things along as young college-age kids do. But this is where the first strange occurrence happens. I hear scratching noises on the side of the tent. I try to remember if we set the tent up next to brush or something. Maybe the wind is causing branches to rustle against the tent. And I mean, oh well, that's the woods, right? But maybe it's a bird or something else too. It stops rustling and we continue chilling as if nothing happened. But then things escalate in a really strange way. It's like the wind stopped and the environment just became perfectly silent. We both felt uneasy, causing us to get sort of knocked out of our playful mood, I guess you could say. She laid next to me as we tried to concentrate on listening to hear if there was a bear or some other animal in the area or something. But then it happened in an instant. Something akin to an explosion hit the tent tremendously hard. I could compare it to as if, say, maybe a log was thrown in like a battering ram against the side of the tent. And I say this because it literally pushed the material in forcefully and felt dangerous, in fact. A surge of adrenaline lit through my body as I felt like something violent was outside the tent. I never knew if I was a flight or fight guy, but I guess my next action gives me some idea, and I yelled aloud, "Give me the knife and the flashlight," as I scrambled up and unzipped the tent with tools in hand. My first thought was that I was going to confront some psycho that was messing with us, perhaps with a baseball bat or some kind of battering weapon. But I kid you not, I launched myself out of that tent and stood up in a flurry to confront my attacker. A few breaths pass as a cold feeling sets in. I do a 360 scan to nothing. Nothing but silence and darkness. Maybe it was a branch that fell on the tent? But no, there was absolutely nothing on the ground where the thud was heard and felt. I yelled out hello again and again to no response until only a moment later in the silence, a chill shot up my spine. "Get the keys and get out of the tent," I said in a frantic tone as my girlfriend listened and now joined me, and I looked at her car that we arrived in and noticed that it was about 30 yards out by the shoddy off-road path. She didn't even need to know what I was thinking as we both just started to speed walk towards it. Now, you might be thinking at this point that I'm just overreacting, but truly, I cannot describe the terror that washed over me when I looked out in the darkness after investigating the tent that night. I could feel like something was watching me, and to top it off, it was eerily silent too. I know that she confirmed my suspicions too when she started for the car immediately without question. Our instincts were telling us to get the heck out of there quickly. The walk to the car was really unnerving and felt like a football field away, but finally we get into the car with the keys in hand, and I took the driver's seat. After turning the keys led to some relief as the engine started. Instinctively I locked the doors and turned the headlights on. We sat for about 3 seconds trying to rationalize what was happening when my girlfriend started exclaiming, "My laptop is moving. Something is in the tent." She said this because she brought her laptop to serve as a lantern after dark. We of course left it in a hurry as well as other items. But I saw what she saw. It was items being rustled around 30 yards away. Without further hesitation, I put the car in gear and started down the rough road. As I tried to calmly drive the car down the dirt path, quickly but carefully, it was a very rough road and I didn't want to get stranded out there. The strangest thing happened next. A loud, piercing sort of ringing noise rang from inside the car's cabin. I turned the radio on and off. I checked the windows. I asked my girlfriend if her car had ever made such noises, and she replied no. I asked her again if she could hear it, as maybe it was just me being under stress, and she said, "Yes, I hear it. I don't know what that is, though." Now, I wanted to write this off as a car problem, but if you were in there with me, you would describe it as some kind of, like bell continuously ringing. It didn't sound like any car noise that I had ever heard before. But my next instinct as I grew up as a pastor's kid, I just remember praying for 10 minutes as I was convinced that it was a supernatural or demonic event. We endured the screech for 10 grueling minutes as, to my relief, it ended suddenly, and it didn't fade out or just go quiet either. The loud ring literally just stopped in an instant. I can't describe the feeling in that car when it stopped too. It is just so strange to look back and remember that I felt internally that the ordeal was over since the ring stopped. What I mean is that everything just felt normal again. The panic, the chills, all of that went away in an instant. We ended up down the road another 45 minutes away and finally stopped at a trucker diner. We slept in the parking lot, or at least she did, as I was still too on edge from the adrenaline dumping that I just went through. In attempted bravery the next day, we went back to the campsite as the sun was up. We investigated, but we saw no tracks or anything except for the contents of the tent tossed around but still accounted for. I was hoping, sort of, I guess, that they were missing so that I could write it off as people screwing with us and plundering our tent, but that didn't seem to be the case. We were packed up and gone in less than 10 minutes as the area still felt really weird. But after that, I haven't been camping since. I would go again, but next time I'm going to go with an RV or at least a relatively known location with others around. This place was the remote mountains of Payson, Arizona, far from civilization, and it's one place that I won't be going again. I live in Florida, and this incident happened about 3 weeks after Hurricane Irma, so a little while ago now. Back in July, the ex and I had just finalized the divorce, and I moved into a gated neighborhood where every house was rented out by the same rental company or landlords. It's a very small neighborhood with about 15 houses tops. All 15 houses are bordered around a man-made lake with the backyards facing the lake. No one really has a fenced backyard, too. When you walk out of your back door, you see the lake in front of you and your neighbors' backyards on each side of you. Everyone in the neighborhood seemed very close. Someone was always hosting a family-friendly party or barbecue, or having people over to watch sports, or something like that. I was and am still depressed about my divorce, so I never partook in these social gatherings. The only person that I got to know was my next-door neighbor, Steve, an active Navy soldier with a huge love for guns. Steve is the true hero in this nightmare too. My daughter, Alice, is 4 years old, and I got her every weekend. Alice's bedroom window faces the backyard towards the lake. I spoil that girl to death too. She truly is my everything, and I count down the days to the weekend every week just to be with her. But that's why I was upset when Irma came, and I had to go almost 3 weekends without seeing her. The weekend before the storm, she was with her mum. Then obviously the weekend of the storm, she was also with her mum. Then on top of that, the weekend after, she had to be with her mum because my power was still out. No AC in Florida is miserable, let me tell you. The humidity was so bad that week that I ended up sleeping in my daughter's room the whole week because she has the only room with a window that faced the lake. I opened the window, exposing just the window screen, so the window from the lake could cool the room as much as possible while I slept. Eventually, the power comes back and Alice starts visiting me again like normal. And that was when the nightmares started. My daughter would complain about the singing lady and how she doesn't like her anymore. I thought that maybe she was referring to one of my ex's friends or one of the teachers at her school. Maybe there was a teacher at her school that sang to the kids that she didn't like. That Saturday night, though, Alice woke up in the middle of the night screaming like I've never heard. I ran into her room and turned on the light and found her hiding under her covers. I asked her what was wrong, and all she could do was point to an empty corner of her room and say, "Look, look." But there was nothing there. She was acting as if she saw a ghost. After I calmed her down, she started to talk about the singing lady again. "Please tell the singing lady not to come back. Please, Daddy, make her go away." Obviously, she was having nightmares, right? I showed her that there was nothing in the closet and nothing under the bed and that there was nothing to be afraid of. She calmed down and went back to sleep. I went back to my room and quickly fell back to sleep too. And it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes before Alice comes running into my room screaming, "She's back, she's back." Alice absolutely refused to go back to her room too, so I let her sleep with me. The next morning, Sunday morning, I took Alice out to breakfast and we stopped by Target to pick up a baby monitor. I haven't used one since her mum and I were still married, but I wanted to easily be able to hear her if or when she started having any of these nightmares again so I could respond quicker. After I set them up, I showed Alice how they worked to give her assurance that I could hear her and she was safe, and that night she slept soundly and didn't make a peep all night. The following weekend, Alice had to stay with her mother again because she caught a stomach virus from one of her little friends at school. It was Saturday night and I was sound asleep in my bed. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it. A woman's voice humming a soft nursery rhyme through the baby monitor. The humming and the soft singing got louder and clearer as the voice got closer to the monitor. I wasn't dreaming too. I could hear a woman softly singing lullabies in my daughter's bedroom. I had never been so scared and dumbfounded in my life. I was feeling a mixture of pure terror and just disbelief. Then the voice spoke out. "Alice, sweetie, are you awake?" Adrenaline shot through my veins. I jumped out of bed and locked my bedroom door. I picked up my cell and I called Steve from next door. He didn't waste a second too. As soon as I got off the phone with him, I heard him storm out of his back door screaming, "Don't you move!" I ran outside and found him aiming his shotgun at a woman crouched outside of my daughter's window, the one that I had left open after Irma and never closed. Steve quickly dropped his guard when he recognized the woman. It was Jean, the neighborhood maintenance woman. Steve's wife came running out after him and confirmed that it was her. Jean played dumb, said that she was not singing and didn't even know my daughter's name. She said that she was near my daughter's window because she was doing her weekly patrol for gators and thought that one approached our house from the lake or something. That was bull though. She was singing, and she called out to my daughter by name. Yes, it's true that there have been a few gator spottings around the neighborhood, and yes, part of Jean's job was to patrol the lake at night every now and then, but at 2 a.m.? I obviously knew that it was bull, and even though neither Steve or his wife called her out on it, I could tell from the look on their faces that they didn't believe her either. The next morning, I went over to Steve's house to thank him and tell him exactly what happened. He told me that Jean and her husband have been known to be a little cuckoo, but this was by far the craziest thing to happen so far. And Steve, the absolute saint, helped me install metal bars on Alice's window that afternoon. I live in a city located in a valley with a lot of smaller towns up the hills and mountains around. So it's part of the local culture for teenagers and young adults to visit these smaller areas during the winter to drink, smoke, and hang out with their friends. My uncle bought a house in one of these areas, so eventually I decided to get the keys and spend a weekend there with 5 of my friends. The house has 2 big bedrooms and 3 beds each, and a lot of extra mattresses as well. At night, we decided at some point to go back inside and just chill and watch TV, but since the living room had no sofas yet, we brought some mattresses from the bedrooms and just used them. One of my friends, Victor, decided to go out for a smoke, and after some minutes, we hear someone knocking at the window just behind us. Everyone got a bit scared for a second, but just looked at the window and said things like, "Oh, it's just Victor." But since we were sitting on mattresses close to the ground, it wasn't easy to see clearly who was at the window, and since the person just stood there looking straight at one of the girls, I got up and checked. I saw a man who somehow looked a lot like my friend, but a bit more fat and older than him, I guess. As I came to the conclusion that it was a stranger, I froze while looking at him and him looking back at me when I said, "That's not Victor." Everybody else froze too and looked at me, waiting for a reaction, but all I could think was to ask what he wanted. He just stood there for a second and asked, "There's a bar nearby and we need a drummer to play with our band. Is any of your friends a drummer by any chance?" Which, weirdly enough, I am, but I just told him no, and after some extra long seconds looking at us, he left. My friend came back and we made fun of the situation, making jokes on how it was him messing with us, etc. Later, most of the group decided to sleep in one bedroom and leave the second for me and one of the girls since they saw us kissing earlier. We all go to bed, but some hours later I wake up to the girl shaking me in horror and whispering that she heard something coming from the kitchen. So I get up, tell her to lock the bedroom when I leave and go check the sound like the moron who always dies first in the films. And as I pass by the second bedroom, I think about calling someone else to join me, but as soon as I see them all sleeping, I hear something at the kitchen's window. I quickly move there in silence, check around, and as soon as I find one, I grab a knife. The door opens right in front of me at this point, and it was that same guy. I knew it was no joke since I just saw my friend sleeping. It probably took like 5 to 10 seconds of just staring at each other, but it felt like an eternity. While still holding the door handle, he made a slow movement with the other hand towards something under his shirt, which was probably a gun or a knife, but I also lifted my hand, showing him the knife, so he stopped. The kitchen was quite small though, so we were standing pretty close to each other, and at this point, we both knew it would end bad for both of us if he tried something, so I just shook my head and said as calm as I could, "Don't." He just kept staring at me a bit more and then finally closed the door and eventually went away. I went back and told the girl that it was nothing and that we should just go back to bed. I didn't sleep that night, and we left early in the morning, and I made sure to ask my uncle and cousins if they ever received weird visits there. They said that the only person who ever goes there at night is the old neighbor when his wife doesn't let him arrive drunk at home, so he grabs my uncle's rocking chair to sleep until he gets sober, and obviously that was not this guy. Now, every year my friends talk about spending another weekend there, but I always make an excuse so we never go through that again, and they never know what happened. It finally started raining here, so I took my 14-month-old mushroom hunting over the weekend. It was later than we normally go, and the sun goes down much earlier, but we were taking a quick trail to the river and back in hopes of finding something. We took a wrong turn, and we ended up going through a big field, which the trail would take us back around to the main trail to the river. As we walked toward the main trail, the last group of people had left, and it was just me and my son. We walked along, and out of a thicket side trail came this weird man. He had a dog with him that was alert at his side. He was staring at us as we walked closer towards him. Then he started waving at us, this really weird sort of slow wave. I was immediately uncomfortable and goosebumpy, but didn't want to be impolite, so I half-heartedly sort of waved back while staring back and telling my son to slow up a little. I didn't want to actually meet up at the junction. After a full minute of us dawdling, the guy slowly turned and began walking down the trail toward the main trail. I was wary walking, didn't want to go too fast, and we stopped to look at some plants, so the guy and the dog got a bit further down this trail, which curved to the right and continued on 2 blocks to the junction. I was thinking, if this is a creepy experience, this dude will be waiting around the corner for sure. And sure enough, he was standing at the junction off to the left and toward the parking lot, and to the right was a .6 trail to the river. The dude was just standing there with his dog staring at us, not moving an inch. Both my son and I were like, holy heck, what the heck is this guy doing? Well, let's keep wide to the right, and saying that he looks old, we could run faster than him and just generally planning for freaky deaky just in case. He kept staring at us as we approached. I asked if he was okay and kept staring back, and he was greasy-haired, tiny round glasses, a blue windbreaker, plaid long shorts, about 50 years old. His dog was a small beagle mix. He didn't answer me at all, just sort of kept staring, and we turned to the right and walked about maybe a block. I had my phone cam facing me, so I could catch him over my shoulder, and the only movement was him slowly shifting his direction to continue staring at us. It was weird, and I had these real predatory vibes watching him do this. It was moderately unsettling, his stare, made more so by his lack of response, emotionless face, weird tiny glasses, slow wave at us like a zombie. But he did leave because on our way back, he was no longer standing on the main trail when we got there. It was a strange experience, and something told me that this guy was up to no good. So I, a 20-year-old female, live with 2 other women, but our boyfriends stay over frequently. I was outside with my parents and boyfriend handing out candy to some trick-or-treaters when I see my neighbor come outside. When we moved in, we quickly met the surrounding neighbors, and these two lived directly across the street. Turns out, too, that the guy was an addict and the wife had a medical condition, so she stayed inside a lot. The husband approached me, though, and my family, and was generally pleasant to talk to before it turned incredibly uncomfortable. After about 30 minutes of speaking, he just wouldn't leave. He began to accuse me and my roommates of throwing out garbage in his garbage can or something. He then went into detail about how he had it on camera and there was a pair of underwear in the garbage bag. He described the person on these cameras as short and stout. I'm 5'10", and you'll see why I'm saying this. He continues to go on about how his wife is mad at him because one of us did it, but he isn't mad and isn't trying to get us in trouble. And after about 15 minutes of this, his wife sends him a photo of my Facebook profile and says that this person's name was on the papers in the garbage. At this point, my parents went in and my boyfriend and I are alone with this man, and he's saying that I must have done it and kept asking why I put these underwear on top, but my roommates and I have never thrown anything in his trash. I found their Facebooks and blocked them because it creeped me out, and he said that his wife tried to call the police about it, apparently. My parents sort of brushed it off, but I don't know. I feel a bit uneasy about this. What do you guys make of this? When I was 9 years old, two of my sisters and I were nearly kidnapped. We were visiting a paternal uncle in a small rural town in the US. My sisters, aged 8 and 6, and we had walked a block or two to an elementary school to play in the playground. To give some context too, this was around 1979, in summer, and the playground was near the street and a parking lot for the school. So, a man drove into the parking lot, got out of his car and came up to us. I was immediately leery. He started talking to us. As far as I recall, we were never taught stranger danger prior to this. In fact, we were told to always be polite to strangers. And this man, he kept trying to convince at least one, if not all three of us, to leave with him. It was very clear with him that this was not happening. I was trying to find an excuse for us to head home as well. He offered something to eat. I responded that my mum was making lunch. I remember him talking about either finding or playing with this dog or something. While he talked to us, I memorized every detail that I could. I also kept telling my sisters we needed to go. They wanted to play, but finally the fire department bell went off. They sounded it at noon every day, so I told my sisters Mum was expecting us at home at noon for lunch. I took them both by the hand and we ran home. Before we went even a few steps though, the man called, "If you're hungry, I can show you my hot dog." And I immediately responded, "That's okay, I think my mum is making hot dogs for lunch." I remember thinking, chew on that, but when we got to my uncle's house, my mum was in the kitchen making lunch. Ironically, she was making us hot dogs too. I tried to tell our mum about what happened and she just wasn't listening. I finally said, "Mum, the man wanted to show us his hot dog." That was when she started to listen to me. I told her everything and she called for my dad and my uncle. I was asked to retell the story, and my father then called the cops. Police officers sat us all down, my uncle, parents, and all three of us girls. I told the story again. My sisters and I were asked some questions. It seemed like the two of them hadn't seen the danger. The police officers then asked me to describe the man and his car, and I was able to do so in great detail. The officers were actually surprised at how much detail I gave them. The officers told us that they would try to find him, but pointed out that there was a large road that passed by this little town only a few blocks further down the road. My parents hadn't considered that when allowing us to play there. We came into town from another direction when visiting. We never heard from the police about this event, and we were never allowed to go to the school playground on our own, ever again. This happened when I was young, maybe 8 to 10 years old. I remember it perfectly, but have confirmed the details with my mother, and the memory of it sends chills down both of our spines to this day. So, it was broad daylight on a Saturday, and I was in the town centre with my mother. The streets were busy and the people bustled past. We paused at a shop front that sold ornaments, the ugly, old-fashioned kind that old grannies like. We'd often stop to look at them and laugh at how expensive they were, wondering how that place even stayed open. I was a real chatterbox as a kid, though, and was talking animatedly to my mother about something or other, facing her as I did so. And like it was yesterday, I remember her smiling face and how it suddenly dropped. Her jaw hung open, and her eyes were as big as a dinner plate. She just stared at me silently for a few seconds and then grabbed my arm hard and pulled me away. Her fingers were digging into my arm as she dragged me into the crowd, walking as fast as she could without running. Being that kid, I squealed and loudly kept saying, "What are you doing? Ow, Mum, you're hurting me, that hurts, where are we going?" while trying to stop. She gritted her teeth though and silently dragged me for about 3 streets before stopping somewhere less busy for a second. It was only then too that she let go of my arm, rubbing it and looking extremely upset. Looking me dead in the eye, she explained that as I was talking outside the shop, she had noticed an old man stood behind me. He was dirty and disheveled, like the horror movie stereotype of a creepy old man. I had long pretty hair as a little girl, and people stopped us all the time to remark on it, especially when I wore it loose. And this old man had very gently lifted a handful of my hair in his hand and was smelling it, tickling his nose as he did so. I was clearly so absorbed in telling my story, I hadn't even realized that I was being touched. My mother made eye contact with the man as he opened his eyes while inhaling the smell of my hair. He gave her an absolute nauseating toothy grin, quickly dropping my hair and waving at her, wagging his fingers all cutesy-like. "Whoopsie, you caught me" was the sort of vibe that he gave, clearly knowing exactly what he did. He then disappeared into the throng of the people moving past. My poor mother immediately felt sick and just went into autopilot, dragging me away as fast as she could in the opposite direction. I didn't even know how to react when she told me what happened, except to be horrified and so glad that we had gotten away safely. I still walk past that shop, and the memory of my mother's haunted expression always makes me feel ill when I think about it. So first of all, English is not my first language, so I apologize for any mistakes in advance. But here's the deal. For a long time in my family, we've seen my mum in places where she physically could not be. Like one day, I was with my sister watching TV and my mum was at work. Then the front door opened and my mum appeared, showing only the top half of her body, bending over so that her waist and legs were out. She seemed sort of, distracted, turned her head in all directions and then asked for my other sister. There are 3 of us. We told her that she was in her room. My mum said, "Oh, okay, thanks," and came out. But it was super weird. But then, a few hours later, she got off work, came home, and we asked her about what happened earlier, and she said that she was apparently at work all day. I want to clarify, too, that my mum is a very serious woman. She doesn't make jokes, and she doesn't lie about stuff like this. So that was obviously super creepy. Other days, we would hear her calling us, and then when we go to her room or the kitchen, we find out that she's not even in the house. But the creepiest thing happened before I was born. My mother was at home at about 9 p.m. watching TV, and her sister was washing dishes in the front of the window. Then my mother heard her sister calling, "Sarah, it's late, come into the house." Then my mum replied that she was already in the house. But her sister didn't hear her. She kept calling my mum because she was apparently watching her through the window playing outside in the garden. Then my mum shouted that she was already in the house. Her sister turned her head towards her, and then she turned her head towards the window, and right in front of the window was a copy of my mother, as a child obviously, only she looked pale and sort of haggard, and very thin. My mother and her sister swear that this was real and that the girl even smiled at them from outside the window. They both ran to their room, and they stayed there all night, being unable to sleep. Coupled with the events that we ourselves have experienced in my home, I really have nothing left to do but believe her as well. I've even seen my mum at night walk through our rooms and leave without saying anything, and she's not a sleepwalker. As a bonus too, my mother was born in a very small town in Mexico. Apparently there are testimonies of apparitions and supernatural things that are there all day long. And since her childhood, she has always experienced supernatural things that are not at all pleasant. Anyway, I'd love to hear what your opinions are and if there's anything that we can do about this. I rented a house with 3 other roommates. After moving in, everything was fine for a while, until 2 of them went out of town. My one roommate and I were in the basement watching movies and decided to sleep on the couches since it was the first night everyone wasn't in the house. When, from right above us, in the upstairs living room, we heard an incredibly loud dragging sound as if someone dragged our kitchen table across the floor, and so we were convinced that somebody was upstairs. We thought maybe one of our roommates came back or something, so we decided to go up and check it out, but when we did, there was nothing. The doors were locked, nothing had been moved, no roommates anywhere. This continued for the next couple of days too, getting worse and worse and only ever occurring at night. We also heard sounds like someone was running up and down the stairs, which was freaky, let me tell you. One night too, we went and checked out all the rooms just to be sure. After turning off all the lights and closing the doors, we checked underneath to make sure all the lights were off too. We heard the sounds again, and when we went back upstairs, the spare room light was on this time. We tried to tell ourselves that it must just be only the house making noises, but once our roommates got back, it never happened again. But things got worse. One night, I woke up to someone banging on my room door. I open it, and nobody's there. I talked to my roommates the next day, and they were all sleeping, apparently. We've all had friends over who have heard the sounds of someone running up and down the stairs, too. All my roommates also experienced waking up in the middle of the night, sensing something watching them. It was creepy, to say the least. But the scariest thing, though, that I ever experienced was one night when I got up to use the washroom, and when I went to open the door, I had a very intrusive thought that said, if you open this door, you'll die. Just wait. I don't know why, but I had an overwhelming feeling of dread, and then it passes, like nothing happened, as if whatever this was just gone. I've never had an intrusive thought like that before. The weirdest part, though, was after most of my roommates moved out and others replaced them, one of them told me they experienced the exact same thing. I never told the new roommates about any details of the strange things that happened there, just that weird things do happen because, I don't know, I didn't want to scare them, but thought that they should know. Sometimes the presence would feel very threatening though, and other times it was really chill. There was a lot more that happened, but I don't want to make this story too long. Oh, and we also got the house checked for carbon monoxide, and it was fine. Anyway, I would love it if anyone has some sort of explanation for all of this, or if they've had similar experiences. Since I moved out, I haven't heard anything strange happen, but have at places that I've lived prior to, so I don't know if it's just me, or maybe it was that house. I want to share something that happened to me when I was really little. My grandma was sick and my parents left me and my sister in our house to go see her. I was 5 years old, a girl, and my sister was 7, I believe. We were told to go to sleep, which we did. When it was already pretty late though, I'm pretty sure way after midnight, I heard meowing outside of our house. I didn't think anything of it, didn't ask my sister, I just went ahead to the front door and opened it. When I did, there were 4 men outside and they looked at me. And I remember to this day one of them had this evil smile. Just by instinct too, I understood that I was in very, very big trouble. And probably within a few seconds, even though it felt like forever, I closed the door and was able to lock it just in time. They went to grab the doorknob but didn't catch it. It just happened so quickly and somehow I fluked it. They started trying to break the door, screaming and cursing, hitting it with feet, shoulders, and who knows what. My sister woke up at this point, and we were terrified. She came to me and told me to go under the bed because if they break in, they won't know that we're home and maybe they won't find us. I was too scared to tell her what I did and that they know that I'm here. I remember being under the bed for a very long time, and eventually those people must have left. I don't know why and after how long, but we fell asleep and stayed under the bed till the morning time when my parents came back and saw the door all damaged, and my sister told them that someone tried to break in. I never did tell anyone what I did that night. I guess I'm just so scared and I panic to this day when I look back at it that I never said anything. I could have been the reason, though, for my sister and me being killed that night. And I still get completely horrified when I think about that night.